Welkom hier by die RPO se konferensie wat ons hou. Dit is iets heeltemal niets waarmee ons besig is. Please be welcome here with us this afternoon and enjoy it, and we hope we can bring some new information about our vision for 2030. Please put down all cell phones, and nobody is leaving the room while we are busy. We can only leave the room while we are playing the videos. Dames en here, baie welkom. U is meer as welkom hier by ons, en ons is regtig bevoorreg om elkeen van u vanmiddag hier by ons te hê. Ek gaan eerstens vir ons open. Let me open for us with a prayer. I'll do it in Afrikaans because my mother tongue is Afrikaans. So I'll do it in Afrikaans, but please bow our heads for a prayer to open this meeting. Onse Vader wat in die hemel is, laat u naam geheilig word. Laat u koninkryk kom. Laat u wil geskied, soos in die hemel, net so ook op die aarde. Gee ons vandag ons daaglikse brood, en vergeef ons skulde, soos ons ook ons skuldenaars vergewe. En lei ons nie in versoeking nie, maar verlos ons van die bose. Want aan u behoort die koninkryk, en die krag, en die heerlikheid, tot in ewigheid. Amen. Everybody, I said already, welcome. And to all our guest speakers, welcome to them, everybody that's here, that's on the Zoom line. Everybody that's on our Zoom, welcome. We've got a lot of people that's zooming in this afternoon also. Aan al ons borgers, welkom aan elkeen van u. Ons sal later aan u elkeen 'n geleentheid gee. We will give to every one of our sponsors today the opportunity also with a video here. So welcome here, and please enjoy this information session. I'll first ask Mr. Gerard Skutte. Gerard is our facilitator here. Gerard, welkom, en ek gee vir jou die stoel oor. Dankie.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. It's a real honor for me to facilitate this conference. The RPO has a vision. We have a vision towards 2030, and we are very, very optimistic about this vision, Chair. And this vision is being shared by our cluster colleagues, and we have big dreams for this industry. And but in order to realize these big dreams, there are always opportunities, but there are always challenges. And that is why we picked the speakers for today in order to address these. And if we say we have this big dream, it's not only us that thinks that there are a lot of potential within the livestock industry, the AAMP, the BFAP, and very important, we also put up the new statutory levy in order to realize this dream. And there's a lot of hard work coming up, but we really look forward to that. Few house rules, if you don't mind. The chairman already said, I say it's like Wimbledon. When we play, nobody in, nobody out, please. There will be no break. We will go up to 5 o'clock. And there will be a link available after this, of this whole session, in order for you to utilize it as you think. There will be, after each speaker, questions and answers. And for the 201 virtual viewers, you are also very welcome to send us some questions. I will be able to look at the chat box. You go to question and answers on your screen, and after you've typed it in, you send it to us, and we will be in a position to deal with the questions. In terms of CVs, Chair, I'm not going to to go into detail. All that I can say is we've got heavyweights, international heavyweights today, and yeah, they are really experts within their fields, and please enjoy them. And that then brings us to our first speaker, Professor Francois Engelbrug. Some thoughts on sustainable agriculture in a changing environment. Francois, most of all, us are humble farmers. We don't always understand the real intricacies of this. And after I've heard you a while ago, I was really impressed. You have the gift to give it over in simple terms to us, and please, we would like to listen to you. Thank you.
Many thanks, Chair and Gerard, and also to Corinne for all the arrangements to get me here today. It's a great privilege to be part of this RPO conference. I've now been researching climate change in Africa for 2 decades, so I'm really starting to appreciate some of the complexities of the changes we can expect on our continent, and I'm also starting to see my own role as trying to provide early warning of some of the impacts we can expect in our region. Whoever helped me to set up the title for today's talk was very optimistic. I'm of course not a farmer or an expert in any field of agriculture. So that quest for sustainability is something that I think many other experts here today and many of you yourselves can make far more substantial contributions to than can I. But what I can do is to point out where several of the main risks are in terms of climate change in the country and in this region. So let's jump into this discussion. I'll do my best. I'll try and use 20 minutes for the discussion, and then maybe we can have 5 to 10 minutes for questions. That would be really nice. So before we talk about the future, I always like talking about what's happening right now. So just for your interest, what you can see currently on the screen, that's the satellite picture of last night at about 8 o'clock South African time. And it shows the source of the clouds we can see today over the Highveld and also here in Pretoria. You can see it's a huge blob of cloud. Its origins can be traced back all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. It's another caterpillar that moved into the Southern African interior this season. We usually have about 10 of these every year. About 2 out of the 10 cause flooding. It's the same type of weather system exactly the same type that caused the Durban floods on the 11th and 12th of April. But this one is causing just some showers over the central interior, and by tomorrow it will be gone. And then there's a next one heading towards the south coast a few days from now. So what makes this autumn and winter quite exceptional was the large number of these caterpillars reaching us. But that's more just for interest's sake. That's another satellite picture that was taken on the 12th of April this year. And it shows the remnants of the cut-off low pressure system that caused the terrible flooding in KwaZulu-Natal. And what makes this system quite unique is if you have a look there southeast of Lesotho, you can see with a bit of imagination a spiraling cloud pattern with a cloud-free region in the middle, that dark region. Now, a meteorologist would tell you that looks a bit like the eye of a cyclone. And indeed, it was the very first time that a system that developed a type of eye, so a tropical structure, developed south of 30 degrees south. And that weather system contributed to the rainfall on the 12th of April. That of course, resulted in the end in about 40,000 people being displaced and 500 people losing their lives, mostly in the morning of the 12th of April. So it's a sign of a changing climate system. So never before did a cutter flow that formed over the interior moved into the Indian Ocean and then developed a tropical cyclone type rotation. And that's something I want to put some emphasis on today, is what about types of weather events or climate anomalies occurring in this region that we've never experienced before. So I'm going to talk about tipping points in the system. Now, to some extent, we can of course be prepared for the types of extreme weather we've experienced in the past. At least we have experience of that. But climate science tells us we should also be prepared for new types of impacts we have no example of in the historical record. So that will be a big part of my talk today. And that is just a last bit of background on this weather system that affected us on the 11th and 12th of April. What is important here is if you compare those three graphs, they show weather maps for three different cutter flows that affected us in the recent past, or not so recent past. In the first case, 1987, September. 500 people died then in what was known as the Durban floods. And then in April 2019, about 180 people died in a flood event caused by a very similar system that caused the flooding on the 11th and 12th of April this year. So why I'm showing these slides is that I also think we need to distinguish between climate variability and change. So in the case of the Durban floods, they were very, very similar events that led to losses of life in the past. There's also evidence of such an event in 1856 and another one in 1905. So one cannot say that the 11th and 12th of April floods was the result of climate change. Climate change changed the structure of the system. It made it maybe 10% more intense. That's what the first investigations are indicating. But in the case of the Durban floods, we really should have been prepared. There were very, very similar things that happened in 1987 and 2019. And that's also a lesson for all fields. If extreme weather events happened in the past that had a devastating influence on a specific sector, and we'll talk about this sector later on, then of course one needs to do whatever you can to be prepared for the next event. So I think with all of that being said, let's move into a discussion on future climate change in the region. The first thing I'd like to point out today is that I think the livestock sector, the maize industry, and I would say almost every single sector in agriculture really depends on what is going to happen in terms of that graph that I'm showing there on the left-hand side. Now that graphic shows future scenarios of carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. And as we meet here today, the fate of climate change, or the extent of climate change, is still in the hands of humans. And I would say that it is in Africa's interest and in agriculture in Africa's interest that the world's climate change mitigation effort gets going very rapidly. If we are going to follow a future where geopolitics sends us on that red line at the top, which is a fossil fuel future, or even that orange line, that is still a future where we largely depend on fossil fuels towards the middle of the century. Climate change, as I will show very soon, is going to be devastating in Africa and in terms of agriculture. And certain thresholds, science tells us, will be reached where adapting to climate change will not be possible. So there are limits to adaptation in terms of future climate change impacts. So what the world is really striving to achieve through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and 197 countries are signed up to this, is a future that corresponds to one of those blue lines on the slide. Those are so-called Paris Agreement type of futures. And the blue line, if that means drastically cutting emissions in the 2020s, cutting emissions by about 45% with respect to current levels by 2030. A very, very, very strong challenge. Some say not achievable. That type of world can still restrict global warming possibly to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the blue type of line, that light blue line then achieves what we call carbon neutrality by 2050. So net zero emissions, no further greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from the middle of the century onwards. The blue line is a similarly strong mitigation scenario, which still gives us a chance to keep global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. So these two thresholds, 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, are thought to be the dangerous thresholds that we should try not to exceed. Above that, the impacts become more and more dangerous. So the first thing to take note of today is the global quest for mitigation. Yes, in South Africa, we also have to make a fair contribution. And it doesn't start in South Africa with agriculture. It starts with our dependency on coal. It starts with Eskom. The coal power plants need to be gone in the 2040s and be replaced entirely by renewable sources of energy. That would be a fair contribution from South Africa. That's where we need to focus on. Otherwise, we will be contributing to low mitigation futures. So let's start to look at how the future depends on these mitigation decisions the nations of the world will be making. I should also say that Africa today, as we meet, remains responsible for only 4% of the world's emissions. So we have a contribution to make, especially in terms of how we are going to develop into the future. But those strong mitigation scenarios, those Paris Agreement futures, we should also admit that achieving those types of futures are first and foremost in the hands of the industrialized countries of the global north, specifically in the first place China and the United States. Okay. So a low mitigation future following those orange or red lines, you can see that sends us towards 4 degrees Celsius of global warming towards the end of the century, and about 2 degrees Celsius of global warming somewhere in the 2040s. I'll soon talk about what that means for us in Africa and in Southern Africa. And with those light blue and blue type scenarios where we rapidly reduce emissions in the next 10 years and then achieve carbon neutrality by the middle of the century, we still stand a chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. By the way, the value now is 1.2 degrees Celsius in 2022. So we stand a chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius in the presence of this massive mitigation effort. And we stand a very good chance of at least restricting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. So that's the global picture. What does it mean for us? Well, over the last few years, I've been contributing to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment reports. And that's the first type of graphic that we generate. It's a map of global temperature change. And it is the regional changes in temperature are there shown as a function of the global warming, the level of global warming. So top left is a world that is 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than what it is supposed to be. At the rate things are going now, we will reach that world in the late 2020s or early 2030s. It's upon us. Okay, you can think yourself whether with the current state of geopolitics, there's still a chance of avoiding that world from materializing, because it will require strong cooperation in the first place between China and the United States. So we may say that that world is now more likely to materialize than not. The important thing to realize is that if you look at the southern hemisphere, Southern Africa is the region that warms up the fastest. The highest rate of warming detected over the last 5 decades in the southern hemisphere has been detected in Botswana. Okay. And that is because of the regional climate system. We can get into some of the details about why it is like that later on. Should we reach 3 or 4 degrees Celsius of global warming, then of course you can see the temperature change in southern Africa are in the order of 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. And that is alarming. So 3 degrees of global warming, 3 to 4 degrees, approaches 6 degrees of regional warming. And that will have a range of consequences for agriculture in the first place. That I'll talk about that later on. 2 degrees of global warming, likely we will see that, and the rate things are going now at least, in the 2040s. That's about 4 degrees, a 4 degree increase in the average temperature in southern Africa. So remember, up until now, the world's average temperature has increased by 1.2 degrees Celsius. We say that's the level of global warming. But here where we are today, the detected temperature increase to date is already more than 2 degrees Celsius. So you can roughly multiply the global value, the global level of warming by 2 to find the level of warming in the interior of southern Africa. So moving forward, the next important metric, of course, to look at is rainfall. So most regions of the world are becoming wetter. Most land masses are becoming wetter. And it's very, very straightforward to explain why that is the case. The warmer we make the atmosphere, the more water vapor it can carry. That means there's more fuel available for storm systems. So water vapor, when it condensates, releases energy into storms. Storms are also becoming more intense simply because the atmosphere is warmer. There's more heat available to convert into, we say, kinetic energy, into the wind speeds and the intensities of the storms. So the general observation across the world is that the land masses, on the average, have already become wetter, and for as long as we continue to warm the atmosphere, land masses will continue to get wetter in general. But unfortunately, there are exceptions. And one of the most important exceptions is the subtropical parts of the southern hemisphere. So if you look at that map, southern Africa, for example, is projected to become generally drier in a warmer world. And that has a lot to do with these changes in the regional circulation system. To explain that in a nutshell, in a warmer world, the cold fronts that bring winter rainfall are being shifted towards the South Pole. So it becomes increasingly difficult for the frontal systems to reach us during winter time. And therefore, droughts such as the 2015 to 17 drought in Cape Town and the current Eastern Cape drought, these long-lasting multi-year droughts, they will manifest first and occur more and more frequently in those parts of South Africa that get winter rainfall. But as the climate system warms and the big high-pressure systems that strengthen over us in winter and that help to shift these fronts polewards become stronger, they will increasingly also impact on winter rainfall. So the IPCC in their 2021 assessment report made 3 summarizing conclusions for Southern Africa. The one is that the region is warming up drastically, far more rapidly than the global rate of warming. The second is that the region is likely to become generally drier with more frequent long-lasting droughts. And the third is that in the eastern parts of southern Africa, including the entire eastern interior and coast of South Africa and Mozambique, we should expect more frequent, heavy rainfall events. Despite the general drying trend, we should expect more frequent, heavy rainfall events. And if we look at the science assessment from the report, if we look at that in more detail, you'll see that the report also makes specific statements about the El Niño-La Niña cycle. And the main message is that on top of these general changes I've just mentioned, variability is also becoming more intense. So when we have La Niña seasons, they will bring more intense rainfall than in the past. But when we have periods during which El Niño dominate, the droughts will be longer lasting and more intense. On the average, the longer lasting droughts have the upper hand over the intense rainfall seasons in terms of the long-term trend in rainfall. But we should at the same time, simultaneously while we prepare for more frequent multi-year droughts, we need to prepare for more frequent La Niña periods with intense rainfall. So there's some evidence, and this is not fully established, that La Niña seasons will occur more frequently. That's not yet regarded as a solid statement by the IPCC. The evidence is not strong enough as yet. And there's also some preliminary evidence that El Niño events will become stronger, like the 2015-16 El Niño. But also for that, the science is not yet ready to make a firm assessment. But what the science is clear about is that when we have El Niño, whether the El Niño itself in the Pacific is stronger or not, the droughts will be more intense in southern Africa, and vice versa with La Niña. So if we summarize those two graphs I've just shown, the change in temperatures globally, and the change in precipitation globally. For any region in southern Africa, we find that type of graph. I'm showing it here specifically for a start for the Theewaterskloof catchment that supplies Cape Town with water. And to explain how this graphic works, we are looking at the x-axis, on the x-axis at rainfall anomalies, annual rainfall anomalies, and on the y-axis at annual temperature anomalies. The blue dots represent the recent past, 1961 to 2005, blue and purple. And then with the colors, we are moving through time until we arrive at the end of the century with the red dots. So you can see in the blue and purple dots something that I think we are all familiar with. Climate in southern Africa is variable. There are seasons with good falls of rain. There are dry seasons. The wet seasons are usually a little bit on the cool side. The dry seasons are usually a little bit warmer. But as the climate system is changing, with the frontal systems shifting southwards, that is the type of future we end up with if the global climate change mitigation process is not a success. So we end up with a future where every year is 4 to 6 degrees Celsius warmer than it's supposed to be. And at the same time, you can see almost every year is drier than what it is supposed to be. All those anomalies are with respect to the 1961 to 1990 period, just by the way. So that shows a regime shift in the climate of the Southwestern Cape. It's heading towards a substantially drier climate that is much warmer. And that, of course, will have a range of impacts. One can really ask the question, can the city of Cape Town grow in a sustainable way without finding a new water resource? Because as I think we all know, all the dams that one can build in the relevant catchments have been built. So something else is needed for Cape Town in terms of a future water resource. This is Katsi Dam, Katsi Dam catchment. You see exactly the same type of pattern. In this case, the anomalies are calculated. This was a IPCC type assessment. So now the anomalies are with respect to 1850 to 1900, that so-called pre-industrial temperature and rainfall climatologies. And you can see the same thing. We are used to this variability, and I think in our farming sectors across the country, we are used to dealing with this natural variability in the climate system. It's sometimes challenging, but our farmers know how to deal with periods of drought as long as they get broken again by good falls of rain, the El Niño-La Niña cycle. But you can see once again, as we head deeper into this century, and as we approach the middle of the century, you can already see with those dark yellow and orange dots, more dry years than what they are supposed to be. So multi-year droughts become more frequent. And the temperature increases by the middle of the century are already in the order of 4 degrees Celsius. That's for a global 2-degree increase in temperature. And then in those last several decades of the century, the annual temperature anomalies are staggering over the interior. You can see 6 to 10 degrees Celsius, warmer than what they are supposed to be in a low mitigation future. So what does all of this mean? And that's where I'll start to conclude. I think if we think about this 3 general message the IPCC wrote down for our region, a drastic rate of warming, generally drier, and more extreme rainfall events in the east. If we think about that, and we take into account that we are currently heading towards 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming being reached in maybe the early 2030s, that's the best estimate, 2040s 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. What can we expect in terms of impacts in our region? Specifically in terms of things that have never happened before. Well, I think the first and most important risk for South Africa as a whole economically is the possibility of a day zero drought in the Gauteng province. So that is something that has never happened before. Back in 2015 or 2016, at the end of the El Niño drought, the level of the Waldam fell to 25%. So the question is, in a warmer world with more frequent multi-year droughts, what is the probability of such a drought occurring not at the end of the century, but in the next 10 years or the next 20 years? That risk is becoming larger. Even if it was a low probability event, it would have such a devastating impact that we must have a disaster risk reduction plan for the Gauteng Day Zero drought, when the eastern megadams can no longer supply Gauteng with the water that it needs. The second main risk there we are, is I think important for today's meeting. The IPCC made quite a staggering assessment back in 2018 in its special report. It made an assessment that should the world warm by 3 degrees Celsius globally, that's now currently expected somewhere in the second half of the century, just because of the biophysical impacts of heat stress on cattle, the cattle industry will collapse in its entirety. At that point when the regional warming reaches about 6 degrees Celsius on the average, because of the heat waves, of course, that then impact directly on cattle. And at the same time, the modeling showed that the maize crop is likely to also collapse entirely. That is the type of world we want to avoid. But the question I'm posing to yourselves today is, what about the socioeconomics of farming? The biophysical heat stress threshold is set at about 3 degrees Celsius of global warming. But how many multi-year droughts can even a small commercial farmer live through before he or she have to give up in terms of a specific sector? So if we think about that, the thresholds may be somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius of global warming. It's not that we have to wait for such a devastating change to occur until the biophysics force the change, force the collapse. And then towards the end of my talk, heat waves, that's a big part of the future. They are part of this potential complete collapse in the cattle industry, but they also impact directly on human lives and mortality. We've seen that just recently with the big European heat waves, the Pacific Northwest heat wave last year. So what does it mean for our own outdoor workers? What does it mean for all our people living in informal housing without easy access to clean water when a heat wave strikes? It's literally life-threatening. And the thing I can say to you with most certainty today is that the heat waves of the next 10 years in Southern Africa will be unprecedented. They will be more intense than anything we've ever experienced in the historical past. And then finally, before I have one concluding slide, we should not forget about the extreme weather events in the east. So climate change also tells us that we should be prepared for more heavy producing weather systems along the east coast. The biggest risk of all is the possibility of an intense tropical cyclone, a category 4 or 5 hurricane, moving as far south as Maputo or even Richards Bay. It can also move into the Limpopo River Basin. And we are not prepared at all for a system of that intensity. It has also never happened before. Some members of the audience may know about Cyclone Des Moines. In today's classification, that is not even classified as a category 1 hurricane, just by the way. And it was quite devastating in terms of the flooding it caused back in 1984. So to conclude, the good news is we do not have to be caught by surprise by any of these changes. If we looked carefully at the science, we should have foreseen the Cape Town drought. The science was very, very clear. It's one of the best documented changes in the climate system, that shift of the frontal systems towards the pole. So we should be prepared for more intense heat waves already in the next 10 years and next 20 years. And that gives us some opportunities to adapt. Each sector needs to look very, very carefully at the relevant metrics for that sector and adapt to the extent that it can. The other bit of good news is that we do not have to see a world that is warmed by 3 degrees Celsius and where biophysics of heat stress result in the collapse of potentially the maize crop and the cattle industry. It doesn't need to happen. It can still be avoided if the global climate change mitigation process is a success and if all nations of the world contribute their fair shares. So, Chair, I hope we have some time left for questions, and those are the main messages for today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Francois, thank you very, very much. I know, when we look at the red meat industry, our approach is not to say it's not us, but to say how are we going to make this better. And surely we have a big role to play. We know what the impact is of the livestock industry, but we also heard from you that this is man-made and we can make it better. There is time for questions for about 7 minutes. I've got one question already. That's from Herman de Wet from KwaZulu-Natal, asking that there's a perception that invasive plant species will thrive in the warmer climates. And if you have a view on that, perhaps it's very technical in terms of agriculture, but do you have a view on that, Prof?
Well, all I can say, it's unfortunately not my field of speciality, but we should think of a future that is substantially hotter, with more periods of prolonged drought. So all plants that are more adapted towards that type of change will of course fare better than the species that are not. Recently I, for example, read an interesting argument being made that in a future we should look more closely at sorghum production in Africa because it's a more drought resistant crop compared to maize, for example. So I cannot make a judgment on whether that's a good idea or not, also if one thinks in terms of productivity of these various crops. But I think each sector really do need to think about where it can make changes and where it can adapt towards species or crop varieties that are more tolerant to long-lasting multi-year droughts in the presence of very intense heat waves. But that's unfortunately all I can contribute in terms of Herman's question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That makes a lot of sense. Any question from the non-virtual floor? There's a question. You're welcome.
Sorry, Chair. We had the cut-off now in April, Prof, and then in May again, within a month. And now in June, or maybe the beginning of July, there was one in Australia. Is this now all in the eastern part of the countries or the continents? I mean, also the eastern part of Australia. Is that now all part of the global warming? As you said, it's happening on the east of each of the continents, and it's a bigger risk, and it's going to happen more and more. Because I followed that, and to me that was very interesting when the Australian people said this is the first time they ever had something like that.
Yeah, so it is really fascinating that the recent Australian floods have been caused by exactly the same type of weather system. And in fact, these cut-off lows, in our case, form over the Atlantic Ocean. So if they actually almost always form over a cold ocean, then they move from the west to the east across the interior. But something very special happens to the weather system when it moves off from the interior towards the coast. Because of the fact that it is initially over the interior and then it moves towards the coast, the system becomes deeper. And the fact that the system becomes deeper in terms of the volume of air that it occupies, that has this interesting effect of building what the Australians call explosive cyclogenesis. So a deep surface low almost always develops along the east coast when the cut-off low moves from the interior to the east coast. And almost all flood events in what we previously called Port Elizabeth or Kobega, the Cape South Coast, Durban, almost all these flood events are caused by the deep surface low that forms off the coast when the system moves from the interior to the coast. So exactly the same process also works over Australia. So that's a technical reason why the cut-off lows are especially dangerous over East Coast regions. But of course, a cut-off low all by itself is a very intense weather system, and they can also cause devastating floods over the western parts of continents. And in our case, the most infamous example is, of course, the Laingsburg flood, 1981. It was also a cut-off low. But the science is not clear whether cut-off lows themselves will occur more frequently. In fact, indications are that they are supposed to occur less frequently because they are part of the same type of family of systems as cold fronts. So they are supposed to be shifting towards the South Pole. But when they occur, because they occur in a warmer world, that they have more moisture available, the Indian Ocean is getting warmer, we can expect them to be more intense and to cause more rainfall than ever before. The systems themselves are supposed, climate science theory indicates that they will rather become less frequent than more frequent over our part of the world.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, only one more question. Wandile, you're very welcome.
Professor, thank you so very much for your presentation. You really helped deepen our understanding of these flows. You made a point there that worries me about the frequent occurrence of these La Ninas. And I wonder if are we going to see a more prolonged cycle of the opposite of that, the El Nino, just like we have seen now this La Nina. And I take your point that you say the evidence is still somewhat shaky as to whether they will occur often or not. I would like you if you can opine on that.
Sure.
Thanks.
Sure, Wandile, such a relevant question. Also, if we think about what's waiting for us in the coming summer. So right now, the indications are, the chance is about 50% that we are going to have another La Nina this summer, which is a bit of a surprise. That will be the third one in a row, of course. The third summer season in a row with La Nina. That has only happened twice before, since 1950. So that is consistent with this preliminary evidence we have that La Nina events will start to occur more frequently. We are sure to soon after that move back into the next El Nino phase. So there may be, if we are fortunate, some neutral years before we hit the El Nino phase again. And interestingly, the science indicates that El Nino events are likely to become stronger, but not to occur more frequently, but cause more intense droughts when they occur. Now, the latter part is something we can already see. Whether El Nino becomes stronger or not in the Pacific Ocean, we should expect it to bring more intense droughts associated with more long-lasting and intense heat waves than in the past. So we need to prepare, to summarize, for a more intense La Nina, El Nino cycle in Southern Africa. We have experience, of course, with dealing with this variability, but it intensifies in terms of the amplitude of the impacts. And the signs that this is already happening is clearly discernible if we look at what has just happened now with the last La Nina summer. And just think back of that absolutely devastating 2015-16 El Nino drought across our interior and into Botswana. That is the type of variability we will see increasingly for as long as the world continues to warm.
Prof, thank you very much. The thank yous will be done later at the end. But thanks for explaining the challenge. And we take this challenge because we see it's a team effort. Thank you very much. After each speaker, there will be a video, either an in-house video or from our partners. There will now be a video from the RPO.
Ons weet waar Suid-Afrika se braaivleis vandaan kom. Ons weet, dit is die eindbestemming van 'n komplekse waardeketting. Van vervoer, terug na verpakking, terug na verwerking en terug na waar dit begin. By jou kudde en jou goeie sorg. Ons weet, die waardeketting begin altyd by jou. By die RPO het ons ten doel om die bedryf namens jou te bevorder en uit te bou. As rooivleisprodusente is ons baie lief vir ons bedryf en ken en verstaan ons die uitdagings van die bedryf. En is dit dan ook ons plig om altyd vir die verbruiker die beste produk moontlik op sy bord te sit.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Gerard van der Burg, a young man with vision, the author of the new statutory levy that was recommended by the National Agricultural Marketing Council for the minister to be signed, and that will start the 2030 vision. Over to you. Thanks, Gerard.
Thank you very much, Gerard. En ja, heerlik om aan te sluit by die RPO Kongres. Yeah, I think it's been a tough couple of months working in the red meat industry, given all the challenges, of which probably the biggest one is currently the foot and mouth challenge. But just before that, even to the previous speaker, just the droughts. So overall, many crises that the red meat industry face, but I think amidst that, I do want to compliment them. They are definitely not wasting the crisis. They are putting shoulder to the wheel and mitigating and adapting. So, yeah, I think the background, the topic, which is the background to the statutory levy, we can't actually get to a statutory levy without understanding, why do you actually need a levy? And that is the majority of the discussion today, or my slides, and what I'll talk about is explaining a lot of that. So starting off just with, first of all, the beef value chain. So knowing that livestock is not just beef, but beef by far the biggest industry in South Africa, we do need to consider the value chain. And the entire approach of the Strategy 2030 is a value chain approach. Something which in the history of South Africa, I think in many debates, in many big boardrooms, where each and every node had to fight on its own and for their own turf, that should never go away, but there should always be a common vision to make the value chain work. And that's why the start of the entire process started off with a value chain. So this slide came from the initial work that BFAP did for the AMP, for the master plan. So to be very brief, starting on the left-hand side, you have your inputs, you have cattle production, you have the processing, and in the end, you have the market. So considering the 4 nodes in the value chain, what we have done, we've explained that there's always an interaction between government and industry with regards to interventions in each value chain. So just if you see those blocks where we explained it in blue and red, that's where industry and government will have to work together for specific interventions within this bigger value chain. So starting on the inputs, the livestock sector is very much dependent on a well-functioning feed sector or grain sector. Without the feed and grain sector growing, again, on your input cost side of cattle production or sheep production or intensive feeding regimes, you're definitely going to come short. Left-hand bottom side, you see land pastures. We don't have an indefinite amount of resources, of pastures. So we need to look after them, we need to utilize them and grow them in order to get the full value from this value chain. The next node, we look at production. So very brief, we said, on the biosecurity controls, herd health, all of that needs to be in place, otherwise production won't flourish. We've identified, and this was now in the master plan process, we've identified opportunities of growth and intervention. So within weaner calf production, just an example, additional 250,000 weaner calves that need to be introduced into the system. If we ask ourselves, where will that come from? The majority of that resides in the subsistence to emerging sector, where there's still, a lot of production efficiency gains that can be reached. The next node, we look at processing, essentially the abattoir industry that needs to be well functioning, well oiled, in order to absorb the cattle into the value chain. And then the last node, the market. So from our perspective, we bring market and production together within a big equilibrium system. So kind of the biggest opportunity lying still in the export market. So probably at this point in time, the export market, given all the challenges, is still, it's a very, very big concern, but a concerted effort by industry to mitigate. And still that remains one of the biggest opportunities in the industry. So just again, think about the value chain throughout the rest of the discussion when you think about statutory levy. So the next slide gives a brief introduction towards the preliminary results of the AMP. So in essence, what we have done within the bigger strategy is to say that between policy and industry and private sector, these strategies need to align. Hulle moenie in verskillende rigtings trek nie. En that remains the focus. So briefly with regards to the beef part of the AMP, we analyzed roughly about 20 different value chains, commodity value chains feeding into the master plan. And this was the outcome of the beef one. So you can see a gross value of production potential of about 8.3 billion rands on top of the current growth in the beef industry. So that's substantial potential that the AMP presents. In order to unlock that, industry with government, with different departments, within the government, had various strategic discussions, workshops, to figure out, what are the interventions required to achieve that potential. And just briefly going through them, first starting again with production. Just an 8% increase in the informal herds, the smaller herds in the country, relates to almost 150,000 additional weaner calves. Just an 8% increase. That can be anything from better weaning rates, better calving rates, etc. So that's just one example. The other one is vacant and underutilized land. More than 1.5 million hectares of grazing land that still lies vacant, which was bought by government, not the right custodians on the land, and that land is lying idle. In other words, we can bring it back into production. Again, great opportunity for increasing production. The next one, aggregation and trade. So this potential and that additional 8.2 billion essentially comes from trade. It comes from market. Without growing the market, currently in South Africa, with the disposable income, the pressures on consumers, and only the higher LSMs buying this valued product, we see very much stagnant growth in the local market, which means we have to export. But that growth in export, again, comes at call it an input cost of better SPS controls, better animal health identification, certification protocols, and all of that, again, is triggered and accompanied with bilateral trade agreements, government intervention, and we need that in place. And then the final one, markets. So at the bottom, you see the PPP to continuously drive national animal health credibility. Without that credibility, the export market, they don't really want to talk to you. So this being just a very short synopsis of kind of the industry discussions with government and saying that these are priorities. We know this is what we kind of the vision and what we can achieve, government, industry, private sector, but something needs to structurally also change. So what we have done, we've broken up the different sectors into these reference group, and the reference group 2 was the livestock subsector. Dewald Olivier, the next speaker, he was the champion running with livestock. And the mitigation strategies was essentially broken up into these 6 pillars. And I know it's a lot of reading, and also for our guests online, so you don't have to do a lot of reading. I'm just going to point out some key ones which will resonate with the industry strategy. So the first one, pillar 1, talks to resolving policy ambiguities and creating an investment-friendly climate. So the first point there was the full implementation of the South African veterinary strategy, something that Dr. Gideon Bruckner will also talk about hopefully a bit later. So that strategy is there. The key question and the key drive now is that needs to be implemented. So kind of at the heading of the slide, you see sign and implement. That implementation can only be activated by government. It is their strategy, it's their department, but the industry has a major role to play in that. So first of all, that's a very important link to today's discussion. The next one, pillar 2, is creating this enabling infrastructure, of which the third bullet, you can see the deployment of a comprehensive national identification and traceability system. Again, this is something government agrees on, something industry agrees on, which needs to be driven together. And then I can point maybe to pillar 6, which is again very relevant if you want to grow market. That's that second bullet, which says establish and enforce import SPS and biosecurity requirements. Without that, again, the market, they will be quite reluctant to talk to you. So this is just some examples of what the industry with government aligns. Now, what's really important is this is for the livestock subsector. So I see our colleagues in the pork industry also sitting here. This is really important because with any trade agreement, there's a give and take. The US, for instance, they want to send more pork ribs to South Africa, and that might be at the expense of, say, the pork industry, but there's a trade-off. There might be the opportunity to send high-value, commodity-based trading type agreement cuts or products into that country, but it might take 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, depending on how actively this process is driven. But the point being that the livestock subsector will have to work together within each one of these pillars. It can't be the beef or the red meat on its own, poultry on its own, and pork on its own. There has to be some commonalities. Out of this, call it policy-driven initiative, it essentially gave birth to the Red Meat Industry Vision 2030. In other words, making sure that the industry takes full cognizance of what is currently in agreement with the policymakers, with government, because in essence, you can have all structures and processes in place, but without your government officer or official giving the okay or the stamp of approval, that container or consignment cannot leave the country. So there's great alignment over there. With that, call it synergy, also comes the benefit of job creation, of livelihoods that get improved, of transformation in the industry. And that's essentially what this Red Meat Industry 2030 is about. So point number one, we need growth in the industry. And our first task from the Red Meat Primary Cluster was essentially saying that we need a vision. We need to figure out, are we heading to Cape Town? Are we going only up until Graafreinet? Are we going all the way to Cape Town? And in order to get to this vision, there are certain hurdles that we need to jump over. But first of all, just to focus on the vision, it's that 20% growth. The potential of the full red meat value chain, in essence, more than 12 billion rand, that can be added annually to the current growth. So that's substantial potential. The next one looks at about more than 1 million households that are directly impacted in the livestock industry. That's households. If you were to multiply that by probably 5 to 8 individuals in a household, and that can be a lot more depending in which region, that's easily 6 to 7 million lives affected by the livestock industry. So great potential for that inclusive growth part of it. And then the final one, which is essentially saying that the plan has to be inclusive. And the word inclusive is quite loaded. Inclusive is anything from working with our neighboring countries. It is working with emerging farmers. It is working with black farmers, small farmers. It is inclusive. It has nothing to do with race or gender or nationality. It has to do with the process of being inclusive. So that's very, very important. We said it needs continuous policy alignment. In other words, the process of implementing this plan will have to be constantly aligning to policy. Because without that, again, your license to trade or your positive impact in the economy, how are you going to measure it? It needs to be measured. And then finally, integrated, objectively, empirically driven. And that word empirically driven is also our part to play from BFAP's perspective, because we can measure a lot of these impacts, we can track it, trace it, and understand what's the outcomes. Okay, so just the steps in getting to this strategy, and again, remember the end goal is the background to the statutory measure. In other words, when you have a statutory measure, what are you going to use it for? And that's why this strategy is so important. Phase one, step one, you need a roadmap. The industry did not have a clear roadmap where they want to end up. And in all of these discussions and a lot of consultation throughout the value chain, we drew up the initial roadmap. And that's a vision that sets a common goal for the industry. And within that common goal, there was 4 strategic focus areas: animal health, inclusive growth, market access, and competitiveness and sustainability. Without those 4, we figured there's no ways of growing the industry. Then the next phase was the industry restructure. And by restructure, it does not mean break down everything and rebuild everything just from scratch. It does mean take key learnings from different components throughout this value chain and restructure that. In certain aspects, you actually have to break it down all the way to the foundation and build it up. In other parts, there's great opportunity to adjust and to refigure certain parts of it. And that's what the industry restructure look at. The important bit is, and what we what we derived was, without an empowered industry strategy champion to operationally drive the industry's focus areas and actions, the industry vision will not be realized. It's as simple as that. So for many years, through, I think, many consultative processes, there's been a lot of plans, a lot of ideas, but very little implementation. And that's not just in industry, or it's not just in government, but it's all over. So I think the compliment that we can give to the cluster was the decision that was made that we need to implement. And that's, again, something that Devil will talk about. And the last phase is the implementation plan. So essentially, we need to get to Cape Town. What are the hurdles? In which town do we need to stop? Where for what? To refuel, to do certain things. You need that clear implementation plan. And out of the implementation plan, you can measure. And that's, again, a very important aspect of what we're busy with. So to draw your attention to the roadmap, phase 1, just get the roadmap going. First of all, we had to develop the vision, we had to set out clear objectives and get the strategy. And out of that, cohesion and structure and implementation will follow. So that's essentially the roadmap process. Currently, we're in that green stretch. For those of you who did athletics, that's probably when you do a 400 meter, that's probably the 200, when you're really tired and the legs start burning. And that's the part of the process where now we need to stick it into 8th gear and keep going. So the node's essentially saying that transition process is activated, and by the 5th of November 2022, that's when the new statutory measure will be implemented. By January 2023, we talk about full implementation on track, and the priority cross-cutting interventions, they are the ones being driven the hardest, and I'll start to show that just now. Okay, so we said it's clear, we have these focus areas, there's the 4 focus areas. We said we need this restructure to take place, and essentially we need to have an implementation vehicle. So now, phase 2, the transition towards service delivery. Again, something that was in the industry, but fragmented. So how do you get that structure of service delivery going? And again, this service delivery needs to tie in with your policy alignment, with your agriculture and agro-processing master plan, with a national development plan, with an export strategy, etc., etc. If it does not align with that, again, you become inefficient and irrelevant. So very important that service delivery needs to understand that process. I'm going to break this up into the 3 segments that we have there. Segment 1, that's essentially sector-wide livestock roundtable. So when we talk about the sector, it's the full value chain for each and every participant within the livestock industry. So the pork, chicken, ostriches, the game industry, that's sector-wide. And within that, you need to, again, have a clear vision, a strategy, objectives of taking the livestock sector forward. For the simple reason that when you're in a trade discussion, it's not just beef, it's not just pork, the SPS compliances, etc. It does look at a sector. So it's important to get that in place. The next one, point 1.1, is the sector-wide funding and efficient execution on the animal health side of the industry. Again, when we think about the government structure within the veterinary department, there's a segment that looks at the entire livestock sector, not just beef, not just pork, but the entire one. In other words, if you have alignment in point 1.1, you have alignment as a sector. And it's again all about efficiency. We can't have 10 conversations and not align them. If you look, call it horizontally on this diagram, you see 1.1.1. At that, call it node of this diagram, that is where, again, it's more of a forum, a discussion point. It's where you create accountability and where you set vision. 1.1.2 is essentially, again, where you have implementation. That is where you have people running on the ground and doing the work physically. Because, again, there's been a lot of work done, call it in the middle tier, on the policy and advocacy side, but not enough done at the bottom part, where the implementation gets going. So this restructure is essentially the objective of the statutory levy is to make sure that there's implementation. So phase 3, the implementation plan. How did we get to an implementation plan? First of all, we said start within the focus areas. We soon realized within these focus areas, the problem is some of them, what we refer to, they are cross-cutting. If you pull the lever over here, it just pulls another lever over there, which means we said, right, let's put them as the high priority cross-cutting interventions that's required. And then we have the other 4. So first of all, get the status quo. What is happening with in each one of these focus area? The next one is develop the interventions for the focus areas. And the next one is what's the action steps? Physically, what needs to be done in order to implement? So that's the implementation plan. So I'll be brief and not spend too much time on a slide like this, which is a lot of reading. This is essentially the short-term interventions. Again, I think this document is already in the public domain, but it's there for the audience to go and read it, to go and evaluate it. But that block in the middle, that is the prioritized interventions with the highest impact in the value chain. Very important, not just for a producer, not just for a feedlot, not just for the abattoir or the exporter, it's for the entire value chain. So, first of all, we said that restructuring, it's already underway, it's happening. Growing this unified voice, it's already underway, it's already happening. The red meat value chain system and data integration. Without a system that can collate, and create, again, credibility and accountability for the industry, it will be really difficult to have, for instance, bilateral trade discussions. So again, the systems part, really important. The public-private partnership part to implement, that's essentially the link back to the AMP. And it's already there. Our colleagues, they can talk more on that. Then we set the identification and traceability. So that's kind of the 4th one. The FMD, high-risk areas, animal handling facilities in a lot of these red line areas and the old former homeland areas, and the vet services. We said industry implementation, government oversight towards animal health, meat safety, and One Health. That's a loaded sentence, but that is probably one of the most important sentences and part of this strategy and implementation plan. Without that, it will be, again, really difficult to take the industry forward. Then within each one of these focus areas, again, key priorities, not to spend too much time in them, but in essence saying that we know animal health is a priority, we know that inclusive growth is a priority, we know that without market access, we won't grow the industry. And then the last one, the competitiveness and sustainability. So that's essentially what the professor also talked about. Drought mitigation, flood mitigation, vaccinations, education and training programs, research and development. All of that falls within competitiveness and sustainability. It needs to be funded and it needs to be well developed to make sure that it's something that can grow the industry. Right, so out of the implementation plan, we had the objectives. So if you think about statutory money or a statutory levy being paid, you want to know that if I pay X rand into this account, that somebody is going to do something with it and we're going to see results. And that's the objectives. So if we look at the 4 focus areas, and at this graph, it almost ties up with some of the objectives of the master plan. But again, within inclusive growth, we know that there's the opportunity to get more than 200,000 weaner cars out of a lot of the black, medium to large producers, out of the emerging sector, and out of idle and vacant land, where production needs to grow. We know that animal health will have to be an objective, and it needs to be implemented. Within competitiveness and sustainability, I think within that node, it's something that you only see the result after maybe 5 or 8 or 10 years, but if you don't start working on it now, you won't be competitive and you won't have a thriving and sustainable industry, especially within the value chain. So those, I think, like, meat quality and grading and product quality, and there's a long list of objectives in that. But then market access, whether it's local and whether it's international trade, you have to have a market for your product within this value chain. I just included that diagram on the right. The The dark green bar is essentially showing our current slaughter utilization of beef cattle. If we were to take that and say, let's take our December slaughters and do it right throughout the year, that is what the blue bar looks like. And the green bar on the right, far right-hand side is essentially saying that if we were to grow to the potential that we see in the industry, basically slaughtering currently 5% of our slaughters going into the export, growing that to 24%, we're going to have the same level of slaughters of what we're currently doing in December right throughout the year. So just to give you some order numbers. Okay, so then the final two slides. We said implementation. First of all, it's the structure. So that bottom one that's highlighted, it's called the red meat industry services. Dewald will talk about that. But essentially what it's showing in this diagram, the top part, which is the primary cluster, the focus of the cluster is guidance, compliance, accountability, cohesion. It is limited in service delivery. The bottom part, that's objective service delivery. So the main mandate and structure is created so that that company can do the services for the entire value chain. And there's a lot of different nodes out of that. You can see identification, you can see the value chain system, you can see animal health services, collection points. That's where the focus will be. The next one is the funding. So essentially the background to the statutory levy was all the rest. Now let's talk about the statutory levy. So the funding portion is saying, and we did call it the economics and the math, but the work and the submission was done by the red meat industry services, and they did a really good job with that. We were very glad that they did all the hard work. We just had to do the calculations. So the funding and the budget, you can see, correlates 100% with the vision, with the strategy, with the roadmap, with the implementation plan. And the reason for that is, again, to have accountability within how funds are spent and how you get the most value out of that as a value chain. So you can see at the far top side, we're starting with the animal health, the next grey line, market access, inclusive growth, competitiveness and sustainability. Within each one of those, certain portions of the current funding being allocated. And then the last one slide is just saying accountability, the KPIs. So this is you are not meant to be able to read that. This is just saying that for all the different focus areas, for each one of the interventions, for each one of the action steps, there is a KPI measuring system. It's to make sure that funds are well spent, well measured, and we can measure impact. And parallel to that also, to see where, tying back to the master plan process, where policy and government and their contribution is also added in this entire process. And maybe just the last point on funding. When we initially started, we said, what's the vision, what's the strategy, what's the budget to get to the strategy? And after a long process, coming up with the current statutory application deal, I think it was starting in November, 13 Rand on a large livestock unit. That 13 Rand is about 850 to, let's round it up, 1,000% under budgeted. So met ander woorde, ons gaan definitief daai bedrag moet groei met omtrent 1000% om by 'n werklike volledige impak te kom. And it's a very large or loaded statement, but the point being that within the current budget, there are only certain things that can be implemented and that you can have positive interventions. But for the rest, you need a substantial growth in the contribution from a statutory or voluntary measure, doesn't matter which one, in order to have the required impact. But I do believe, get the structure right, and out of that structure, there's a lot of change that can come. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it being here.
Gerard, thank you very much. I told you he's a very innovative young man. Now, I think it's very, very clear. This is not business as usual. This is the cluster, the RPO, NARPU, the Feedlot Association, the Abattoir Association, came together, and I think we were brave to say, BFAP, give us a what-if gap analysis on the industry. Yes, we had certain flows of income from the current statutory levy, and we were not sure where we will end up. So this was really, I think, the way to go. And what's on the table, if you ask me, and we will listen to Dewald just now, is the new implementing agency in order to get there. And we talk a bit of budget here, Gerard, but I always say I'm involved in the Animal Health Forum, and I speak under correction. But government's budget for animal health is 1.5 billion rand. So I'm sure that within the new cluster and within the new statutory levy, we must take hands, constructive engagement with government, and help guide where we should spend the money. We must not think we must generate everything on our own. That then brings us to questions. Before we go for questions to Gerard, I just want to say thank you very much. We got a lot of questions, especially after the first speaker, especially on the virtual one. Be assured that if your question hasn't been answered, we'll give it to the experts. We will answer all the questions, and we will also take it back to you so that you can see what the answers are. That then, any questions to Gerard? You must be quick, because otherwise I'm going to ask.
Fantastic.
Can I ask a question? Gerard, in this whole process, and I was 100% on the same page, is that trade is very, very important. And we are very optimistic about the export market, but we always said to each other that the local market, 96% of all beef being produced are sold in the local market, 99% of all sheep meat. The mishaps that we have now in terms of animal diseases, how do you see it? Does that throw us in terms of our strategy for the future? I hope not. But I also think that we really have to focus on the local market, and I also think that it's very important. We heard Prof. Francois just now. It's not about just speaking to the consumer on, how can I say, the product, but also the whole image of our industry and production. What's your view, Gerard?
Yeah, it's always great having a naamgenoot. So Gerard, thanks for the question. I think it's probably one of the most relevant questions given the current situation, right? So if you do get a full export ban, what do you do with product? And I think there we can definitely learn from other industries that have been in very similar situations and how quickly they had to adapt. The problem being that in the livestock industry, it is a live animal. It's not like in fruit where you can manage and mitigate in a lot of different ways. So from a market and value perspective, our product probably being undervalued by between 40 to 50%, given what our peers are getting in the international market. So I think the incentive to be in that market and to stay in that market, and how that price comes back to the local front, that should always be the vision and the focus. But the reality being that if that closes off, like with a guillotine, what do you do then? Which means you do need to keep your local consumer happy from a meat quality and meat safety perspective. You need to keep your local consumer fed at the right price. In other words, to make sure that you don't have these massive fluctuations in certain parts of the carcass. And that's probably the biggest focus that came out of the market access bit was, if 20% of the carcass can give you 50 to 60 to even 70% of the value, that should be the focus. And there's some great options with commodity-based trading, etc., where if you can manage to do that, even amidst everything that we're seeing in animal health, there are ways to mitigate. But the bottom line being, if we don't have this, we call it the relief valve, essentially, we'll see a serious stagnation and a decline, like in a decline in the full value chain price. In other words, not just the weaner calf price, but definitely the A2 price as well. So I almost want to say, Gerard, we almost don't have an option but not to export, but at the same time making sure that the value created locally is maintained, and to some degree, if you can increase it, increase it. But what we've seen is, from a disposable income perspective, from a consumer-based perspective, we don't foresee that, LSM groups, 7 and less, growing in red meat consumption on the priority cuts, on the high-value cuts. There's limited scope for growth. So we do need to capture that value out of the carcass in order to be competitive and sustainable.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? We had input from Elmarie. Thank you very much. The consumer expenditure is too dominated by meat. How can we get each individual to spend an extra 20 Rand every day? Marina, I think that's where we want to be. And that is exactly also where we want to be in terms of the export market. We must never only think local. And I look so forward to Dr. Gideon Broekner's input later today. Dr. Gideon, you must help us how we can still export despite all the problems we have in terms of animal diseases at this stage. Unfortunately, that is the end of this session. The video that we will watch now is from BKB. Mike van den Berg, I hope you're still here. One of our dear partners. Thank you very much.
Trust is earned. At BKB, the success of our clients is our greatest triumph. And as a leader in agriculture, we are committed to driving the prosperity of our industry. For over 100 years, we have supported South African agriculture across wool and mohair, livestock, grain, lucerne, sugar and fruit, stretching through to property and retail. In every arena, we can support with experience, knowledge, and groundbreaking solutions so that our clients reap the rewards. We also know that this can only be realized if every hand serves with excellence. That's why we put our people first, with relationships built on integrity and respect, and systems that empower each individual to grow and refine their skills. Our shared principles and drive for value creation enables consistent, exceptional service to our clients. As BKB, we also recognize the need for training in order to alleviate unemployment in South Africa. The shearer learnership and wool handling programs are but two areas where participants are given the skills that can uplift while adding value to the communities and larger industry. Our expertise is built on deeply rooted knowledge and an innovative spirit. Across the BKB Group, we strive for constant renewal, incorporating the latest technology for improved efficiency and increased profit. We work to stay at the forefront of digital solutions that offer added value to our clients. Our digital auctions platform significantly increases the marketplace and potential success of an auction. Another example is Radio Frequency Identification Solutions, or RFID, which creates a streamlined, transparent, and accurate documentation system that benefits every player in the chain. We know we have a part to play in the future we want to see. We are involved in numerous sustainability, regeneration, and environmental care projects, and work to educate our community on farming practices that can help to reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. At the same time, we need to assist farmers in navigating the effects of climate change while increasing food production for a growing population. For this, they need the best mix of agricultural technologies and innovations. We further recognize our responsibility to enable social reform in agriculture by empowering previously disadvantaged groups to contribute to the value chain in a sustainable way. We take pride in our responsibilities. We will continue to support the welfare of local farming communities and nurture international relationships that increase the appeal of our offerings. We will continue to drive the quality of local production, backed by successful marketing. and we will continue to steer smoothly into the digital revolution. We are the trusted home of agriculture. We are BKB.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dewald Olivier, the CEO-to-be of the cluster, the RMIS. And if I've said that, I must say that this whole process we will not achieve if we don't trust each other. Now, if you asked me 5 years ago, was it at all possible to have a CEO coming from the Feedlot Association, and I would have said no. So that is an indication where we are now. Now, Dewald is quite a fast guy, but all I can say to Dewald is that we are on your heels. We are pushing you faster, but we are a team, and we like to listen to you.
Dankie Gerard. 'n bietjie Afrikaans. Net so 'n klein bietjie. Ek het slides voorberei, maar soos die mense, meeste wat my ken, gaan ek so 'n bietjie nie afwyk van dit af nie. Ek gaan net nie die hele tyd daarby hou nie. Want ek dink baie van wat Gerard gesê het, gaan ek nie noodwendig net herhaal nie, want dit is waaraan ons saam gewerk het. So ek wil graag net 'n bietjie gesels oor dit wat nuut is, dit wat anders is. So vir die mense wat online is, ek dink daar's baie van die amptenare wat deelneem daaraan, dan gaan ek nou weer Engels toe. So thank you Gerard, and thank you RPO for having me here. Yes, we've got a new cluster, and we've created this cluster. Obviously, we had to come together from a position of trust. When I started, and maybe it's fairly recent, in 2018, when I got here, there was a lot of mistrust, miscommunication, and obviously a lot of, and I can say it, bickering with regards to many things within our industry. And within the first instance and the first discussion I had with Gerard, I don't know how he knew it, but he bought me with a pie, with a meat pie. And we sat in those chairs of the National RPO's office, and we had a discussion. And I think we said from the start that if we do not work together, we're going to lose the industry. We have to look at how do we rebuild or build this industry together. We cannot go back in the sense that we look at opposing each other in everything. We've been in a situation, and I'll show you within the RMIF, that, there you are, we've had a levy since 2005. And obviously this levy has done many good things. I mean, many good things has come from it. But it's now time to move on. To move on from what has happened in 2005, it's 17 years. A lot can happen. 17 years ago, okay, I'm not going to mention my age, but I was still a very, very young man. I still had hair. No, I didn't. I lost my hair in matric. But a lot of things has changed. And if we're not going to stick to the times, if we're not going to grow together, if we're not going to change, we're going to be the black sheep of the agricultural industry, which to a great extent we already are. When I stepped in, and I can say this again, I'm very blunt with regards to the fact that we kept on taking government to court. We kept on fighting them over things which were not necessary to take them to court. Now, me, being a lawyer in profession, which I shouldn't also say very loud, but the only people that win in a court case are the lawyers. I can tell you that, because it creates damage. It's damaging to relationships. When we started out, yes, we looked at, and I can say this, 50 Rand, 100 Rand, 150 Rand for a statutory levy per animal. You know what we decided? We need to rebuild trust. For 17 years, we've lost trust. Not only amongst the people whose money we have, but the people who we work with, the people who we operate, the people who needs to sign the export permits. where I still am with the feedlots, I can tell you it's very difficult to today fight in court and tomorrow request a signature on an export permit. Doesn't sit very well. It doesn't work that way. We need to, and that's why we came and we said we need to relook the way that we operate. Are we saying that we are in a laxy-daisy situation where we just say, just go on? No, not at all. It's much more difficult. I say this, and I've said it when I had a practice as well, to sit around the table and resolve issues across the table than to stand in a court. Because a lawyer draws up a summons, he issues the summons, you never see the defendant or the plaintiff, the other side, until you get in court. And you don't even speak to that person. It's difficult to sit across the table and negotiate a favorable outcome for all of us. And we have to now negotiate a favorable outcome for our entire industry. Because we're losing. We're sitting in a current situation which Gerard and everybody mentioned, Gerard's, with regards to foot and mouth. We've got many other diseases in the livestock industry, but to us, foot and mouth disease is crippling. We could have solved this, my opinion, 10 years ago, if we just listened to each other. We have to work together. See the guys of the auctions, Anton and Johan. We have to work together. We have to understand that we are a value chain. We have to include each other. Are we going to agree on everything? No. Are we always going to say the same thing? No. But being bigger, a bigger person is to say that although we disagree, we look at the outcome for the rest of the country. So I said there were too many role players. In the RMIF, we had 13 role players, 13 people who made decisions on how we spend 80% of the money that we actually, the people in this room, up until, let's say, the abattoirs, the primary person who created this cluster, people had a say over our money, which actually created a lot of animosity, stress, fighting. There were no focus. Obviously, you cannot service the entire value chain of red meat, as you cannot service the entire value chain of any commodity, unless you like the pork guys. They own commodity and own value chain on their own. I said, okay, too much dilly-dally, hanky-panky, crisscross, all of those type of things. It didn't work. And so we said, let's create a company. Now that, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but that is I'm thinking of going there. If you look at the red figure there, it includes three things. It includes a person, the biggest asset that we have in our industry, the red meat industry, are people. It includes a person. The second thing is the two pointy horns, which could either be goats, sheep, or cattle, is the second biggest asset that we have. And it looks like, if you look at those two horns intertwining up until the bottom, it looks like those DNA pictures that we see. And to say that cattle and people are in our blood, that is our DNA. And that is what the red meat industry service need to do, is to further that what happens on the ground, where the takkie hits the tar, daar waar die takkie die teer slaan. That's what this company needs to do. Implementation, implementation, and implementation. Quickly, we look at a setup where we've got a director of each of the industry organizations, the RPO, NARPO, the abattoirs, and SAFA. This is just a rough idea of what we said. We're still in negotiations with regards to the memorandum of agreement, because I'll get to that. It's very important. Independent chairperson, and a few, and still in decision, experts. We're going to listen to Dr. Gideon Bruckner later. He could be, for example, one of the experts, which we include in this company as a director, to guide us with regards to OIE, etc., etc. Many things that we're looking at. So we need to look at experts outside of the guys in the coalface who can guide this company. We must remember this company is a services company. It's not an advocate for the RPO or SAFA or the Abattoir Association. This is a service company that will implement. The RPO will do its own, this will continue, irrespective of the RMIS. but the RMIS needs to execute whatever is decided by its board. What is the difference? So we've got far less role players, which makes it easier to make decisions, and it's very much focused on the primary side, red meat, primary, and livestock cluster. Now, if it's the red meat, primary, or livestock cluster, or it's the primary guys. It's from NARPO, RPO, it's those four industry organizations, and that's what we have. Much shorter. The collection point obviously was a very much needed discussion. Previously, what happened, and I don't think we should go into too much detail, but there was a deduction at the auctions. Whether or not it was a physical deduction or a write-up within the books, we said, let's not do it for the next 4 years. Let's look at only collecting at the abattoir, which means that the value chain will pay for the levy. So there's no more, I pay R5, you pay R6, and at the end of the day we collect R7. What will happen? It's again that bickering with regards to I pay more, I say more, because he who pays says. We've taken that out. As a cluster, we said, and Gerard started with it to say trust. We said, let's trust each other. Let the value chain pay for it. We will have to relook this in future. We will have to relook systems to manage this better. But from the start, we said that we need to break out of what we currently have. We need to build something new. And this is starting something totally new, in the sense that it's one collection point and the value chain pays. Right. And again, it's a collective approach. We're saying that the value chain will pay for the statutory levy. It's not one portion of it pays more, less, etc. We are equal partners. Now that's sometimes very difficult, but at the end of the day, that's the way that we should do it. We are equal partners in the red meat industry of South Africa. RMIS, like I said, is an administrative body, so you must remember how it will work in the future, that we currently have the MSMS, the Meat Statutory Measure Services. That's the company that is the administrative body that manages the statutory levy, collected by the red meat levy administrators. And from 5 November this year, RMIS will be the administrative body. So RMLA will still collect the levies on behalf of RMIS from the abattoirs, but that money will flow directly into RMIS. Okay. And RMIS will disperse. There was a whole list of functions that Gerard listed there. Those are the KPIs that this company needs to adhere to. Now, I've looked at it, it is immense. There are so many things that need to happen. And you said we are 1,000% under levied, if I can say that. We've got a long way to go. However, trust. We need to show the guys, and again, maybe from my legal background, I can say that the people that pays this money needs to understand and regain their trust within the industry role players and the guys that does the work. We cannot continue to promise things and it doesn't happen. The agreement that we have, the memorandum of agreement, is in final stages. So what we've done is, so a normal company has a memorandum of incorporation which sets up the rules. And we said, let us as the 4 role players draw up an agreement what we want to see within this MOI. We're in the final stages of it, and I think within the next week or so we will finalize it and get it done. I'm just waiting. Well, I can't put it on you. I said wait. But we've got an email coming with dates. So then we will finalize it. We've got the inputs of everybody now to finalize that agreement and finalize the MOI. And then obviously it can kick off. Very important, within the first 12 months, we're going to have an audit. So we're going to look at what has happened. So if Koning wants to tell Dewald, listen, through the structures, obviously, I don't like what you've done, we need to relook X, Y, and Z, it can. The RPO and all the cluster members can come together with the board and say, we've lost a little bit of focus, we need to go left, go right. But we've also said, and you'll see the second last one, that the functions will not change within the first 12 months. We'll say it's not just pulling out the throat, killing it, cutting the throat and throwing it away. We need to have consistency. We need to keep it as it is. So the functions that was delivered by the cluster members as it is will continue for the first 12 months. Obviously, there will be some changes. For example, one of the things that we have is we look at the red line area and collaboration with government. We have spent 10 million rand on consumer education on cattle. As so far, I currently receive roughly 10 million rand to do that. What we're saying is we can appropriate those funds much better if we create something, some sort of PPP. It's already there in the RMIS, and collaborate with government and say, how do we contribute? How do we make this better? Because our focus should not be today to spend 10 million rand on getting new consumers. Our fight is now against a virus called foot and mouth disease in our industry. And we need to appropriate it there where we need it the most. Is consumer education important? Yes, it's very important. But we need to manage where we need to spend our money now. In 24 months after that, so 12 in the next 12 months, we're going to have another audit, and we're going to see whether or not we're going to continue with this. So there's a continual process of auditing, in the sense to say that the trust, can we trust each other, which I think we will. I think we've gone very far, and we come very far to trust each other. So the 4 focus areas is also very important. Gerard, you mentioned the 4 focus areas, and let's start with the one that says market access. Sometimes we see market access as international markets. Market access is also local. We sit with the red line area, which we need to look at with regards to what do we do with the animals. Last night I said to some people, we've got plans with regards to how do we get our animals out there. And that is devising strategies for market access. There they are, animal and public health. We should not neglect public health. Okay, we look always at animal health on the one side, and we say it's very, very important. Obviously, it's what we have. But if we look at, and it ties up with the competitiveness and specifically sustainability, and our public health is of the utmost importance as well. We need to implement things, structures with technology. We've got technology. We've got cell phones. We've got programs. We've got technology on our side. We need to utilize technology more. We're being left behind. Inclusive growth, I think, Gerard, you mentioned a lot on that as well. I think inclusive growth to us is a terminology that we grabbed from our honorable president. He used the words inclusive growth. It is growing the cake. It's not cutting the cake in smaller pieces so that more people can have a cut of the cake. It's growing the cake. Growing the cake would mean that we're going to stagnate. We're going to actually shrink if we only look internally. The people in South Africa are hungry. The people in South Africa don't have money. The people in South Africa is not going to have money for a few years to come. We need to continue to export. But we need to do it responsibly. And we need to keep on servicing the consumers within South Africa. So we need to always keep that in mind. We cannot neglect our consumers. The people who trust our product, actually they trust us blindly in what we put on the table. And we need to continue serving them. Market access, I explained, and then obviously competitiveness. And that competitiveness is obviously amongst each other, internationally, and also with regards to other products. We start to see the analogs. We start to see people that create grass type of food, animals, or the food that our animals eat, they create and they serve it up as patties and wors and a lot of stuff. And it's time, and obviously we're fighting for space. We're fighting for space on the shelves of the retailers, and that includes competitiveness in that sense. So it's very, very broad. We should not be restrictive in what we see there. I think, Gerard, yours was a lot more elaborate with regards to what is in there. But in short, it's it. But that is only a start. That is a drop in the bucket of what we can do. Again, I want to reiterate, it goes back to trust. If we cannot be trusted with 42 million rand per annum, we shouldn't be trusted with 300 million. And we need to execute on that to the advantage of everybody in this room, everybody out there who's not in the room, every role player, every participant, every person who sells animals must be part of it. Maybe just from a point of, we're talking about inclusive growth. We've already created a company called Red Meat Industry Transformation, Education and Development, who has already gained a lot of traction with regards to transformation or then inclusive growth, who already engaged with government and specifically AgriCita and got an amount of money to assist us to do transformation. So the fact that we're working together is actually opening up doors. We have limited ourselves in the past with regards to being fragmented. If we work together, if we coincide, if we are in agreement to many things, we can unlock international funding with regards to what we do. I can tell you the fact that we've missed opportunities, for example, with the World Bank, is because we were fragmented. They spoke to SAFA, they spoke to the RPO, they spoke to NARPO, and at the end of the, they missed the RMIA. And you know what? If we just agreed on simple things, we could have unlocked a lot of funding for the red meat industry and specifically our portion of it. Yes, so I'm very excited. I'm in a position and a place where I'm saying that we're going forward. We're moving forward. This is going to be scary. Change is never easy. When I started losing my hair in Standard 9, it was very scary. It's still scary. However, I think it's exciting times. I think we're looking at new ways of doing things. Rudy sitting here from SAMIC side. I think we're looking at new ways. Rachel, traceability. We're looking at new things. One of the things that we have in store, and I think one of the quick wins for our industry is traceability. We're not far off. We're thinking we are. Because we see tags as a stumbling block. Traceability is not a tag. Traceability is much more than this, but it's much simpler than a tag. And we keep on looking at, we're finding problems for every solution. Rather to look at what is easy, the easy pickings. We've got many easy pickings. We've got Corin and Angela here from Design Biologics. We've got the people. We've got the people in South Africa. We've always been saying it. We've got good farmers. I've been on record to say that it is the exception that there are farmers that do not have traceability. They've got it. We just need to formalize it. We've got feedlots, I can say, that do not have traceability. We need to teach them. We've got abattoirs who still need to work on themselves. We've got vaccine manufacturers who've got the knowledge. I want to say something. I think we've got a government that can do the job. We just need to assist them. If we say we work together as a cluster, we need to work together as a value chain. Government are enablers in our value chain. We cannot do it without them. If we think we're going to export and grow by 16%, our exports from 4% to 16% without government, we are dreaming. We cannot do it without them. We need to work together, even on that. And what the RMIS is saying is, where do we participate? We're actually putting our hands up and say, government, we want to help you. But it's not, again, I'm going to say it as it is, it's not the RPO helping. It's not SAFA helping. It's not the Abattoir Association. It's not NARPO. It's an independent organization assisting government without political ties, because I think SAFA can sometimes be political. I don't know about the others, I can't comment, but SAFA can. It's an independent organization that wants to work together with government in a private-public partnership or whatever vehicle is necessary to do what needs to be done, because we're sitting idle, we're sitting on our hands, and while we sit there, we can say it, I can say it. The poor guys are actually doing very well. They're running. The poultry guys are running. The freaking vegetable guys are running. What are we doing? We're fighting because is it yellow tags or is it freaking green tags? So what? Let's put it in and do it. So, Yes, I'm very excited, Gerard. Thank you very much. Thank you to the RPO. Thank you, James. I can't see him, but thank you very much for having me. And I'm excited about this new structure. I'm very, very excited that we're going forward. We're changing things. I can tell you also that from the NAMC side, they welcomed the fact that we are working together, that it's not fragmented. Because you must remember, with the current statutory levy that we're having, our transformation projects are fragmented. We've got 500,000 here, 200,000 rand, 300,000 rand. Obviously, that will have much less of an effect if we put 2 million rand together and do something effectively. Or how much do we have? 10 million rand in that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gerard.
Dewald, thank you very, very much. That was good enough to earn you another pie, and it will not be a chicken pie. Yeah, from our side, full support. You can see that Dewald has a lot of qualities, but the one quality you must have in a job like this is to be a people's person, and we know you are that. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but he's not a very busy man, so let's send him a lot of questions, and we'll get the answers from him. That then brings us to the next video. It's from Voermol. Kenny, we will have you later on the stage, and thank you very much.
Voermol is vir meer as 55 jaar al 'n baanbreker in die veevoerbedryf. Ons is trots op die pad wat ons gestap het, asook die vennootskappe wat ons met landboubesighede en boere reg oor Suid-Afrika gesmee het. Die Voermol verhaal is gegrond op die wetenskap, tesame met 'n onwrikbare benadering tot gehalte. Ons ontwikkel voortdurend innoverende nuwe produkte wat ons bestaande reeks van melasse-gebaseerde aanvullings komplementeer. Sodoende verseker ons dat die genetiese potensiaal van herkouerdiere keer op keer maksimaal ontgin word. Ons hoogs ervare en kundige tegniese en verkoopspan word geken aan hulle betroubare vennootskappe met kliënte. Hierdie span lewer kundige advies wat die produksie en winsgewendheid van boerderybesighede verbeter deur middel van ons wêreldklas produkte. Soos wat ons groei en ontwikkel, onderneem ons om vol te hou met die lewering van kwaliteitprodukte en dienste aan ons bedryf en om verbeterings voorop te stel in alles wat ons doen. Dankie vir u volgehoue vriendskap, loyaliteit en ondersteuning. Kom ons werk saam aan 'n toekoms wat blink en volhoubaar is. Wat die natuur kort, sal Voermol voorsien.
Thank you very much. That then brings us to our next speaker. And as we've already acknowledged during the day, perhaps our biggest challenge at this stage in terms of where we're going with our industry, biosecurity. Dr. Gideon is an international heavyweight. He made us proud at the OIE, and he was also honored in that regard. And over and above that, he's a dear friend of our industry. He played a vital role in the biosecurity task team, and is currently playing a vital role in terms of the day-to-day decisions on a technical basis when we are dealing with all these new outbreaks. Dr. Gideon, we would like to listen to you.
Thank you very much, Gerrit. I hope you can hear me.
Loud and clear.
It's a great pleasure to speak to you. Although I'm sorry I can't be there. I hope it will suffice by using the technology, and I hope I come right to the technology. So the main topic that we will address is to look at biosecurity and animal health, to see what is the responsibility of the producer, and is it something that the producer should be involved with or worry about? So what I will do is to address the most important issues. I can't do everything in this short time span, but to look at use the current outbreak of and threat of foot-and-mouth disease as a template to link that to biosecurity. And then I think for all of us, it's very important that we know what we are talking about. What is biosecurity? For me, it is something that is as old as farming itself. It's something we've applied since everybody started farming in biblical times. And we're just giving it now a fancy, but it is the same thing that's been applied in many, many ways over many, many years to prevent the spread of disease. But I will give you a more definite or a clearer definition on that from the view of the OIE. Then what we will look at is just shortly look at the most important threats in terms of biosecurity. What are the things currently that we should worry about in terms of biosecurity? And then what is the current awareness about animal health biosecurity in South Africa? Are we, as red meat farmers, fully or really aware what it is and what we should do? And then also, I just said that biosecurity is a very old concept. It's the same as people talking about compartments. Compartment is just a new name for something that we know for many, many years. It's been applied in the feedlot industry. It's been applied in the poultry industry and the secure farming that we had in the swine fever control area. So it's biosecurity that there are things that is already available, and we just have to see how that fits in and how does that teach us about biosecurity. I'll give you some examples on that. Then lastly, I think it's important that we look at the most important procedures for the farmer, for the producer, for effective biosecurity. Nou, as ons kyk taal praat, ons praat dan van wat is die aanvaarbare internasionale standaard of definisie van biosekuriteit. En ek dink, omdat Suid-Afrika en 182 lande wêreld is lid van die OIE en dat ons een standaard het, en dit is, as die OIE 'n definisie maak, dan word dit geïmpliseer dat dit is ook 'n internasionale standaard. So die definisie van die OIE is basies dat dit is al daardie maatreëls wat ons moet neem om die risiko vir die inbring, maar ook die verspreiding van dieresiektes te voorkom. Dit is die kern van biosekuriteit. En as jy terugdink wat ek nou vroeër gesê het, is dit iets wat elke regdenkende boer in elk geval al vir jare doen, maar daar is net 'n goeie of 'n slegte manier om dit te doen. Dan kan ons nie van biosekuriteit praat, en die OIE het dan ook 'n definisie daarvoor, vir 'n biosekuriteitplan. So dit wat ons doen op ons plaas, die produsent of in 'n voerkraal, moet wees volgens bepaalde prosedures en maatreëls, hoe klein ook al, wat ons saamstel en wat ons toepas om die risiko van die breuk in die biosekurireitketting teen te werk. So jy het 'n definisie van biosekuriteit, en dan moet jy ook 'n plan hê hoe jy daai biosekuriteit beginsels sal toepas. Dit help nie om skielik hier op nommer 9 net op besluit, maar hier's nou 'n bedreiging van back and closure, en nou moet ons skielik dit doen. Dit moet reeds in plek wees in terme van 'n biosekuriteitplan. As ons kyk na die risikofaktore reg oor die wêreld en ook in Suid-Afrika vir wat beïnvloed biosekuriteit? En hierdie skets daar aan die regterkant, ek hoop julle kan hom duidelik sien, dis een wat Wyle Fred Meton jare gelede al gemaak het, waar hy die bedreiging vir die rooivleis-bedryf uitspel in 'n pragtige skets. En een van hulle kan julle sien is daai blou diere, dit is back and closure. En dit is vandag net so waar as daai tyd toe hy die skets gemaak het. Maar as ons kyk na die opsomming van die belangrikste biosekuriteitsrisiko's op die oomblik en ook al vir baie jare, en is die een van die sterkste een is maar nog steeds internasionale beweging en handel. En ons kan dit kleiner trek ook in terme van nasionale en lokale beweging en handel in diere. Dit weet ons nou almal die het ook nou daarna verwys die risiko's wat ons het in terme van beweging. Dit is nog steeds in terme van nasionaal, lokaal en internasionaal die grootste bedreiging vir die breek in biosekuriteit en om biosekuriteit maatreëls te toets en te bewys, is hulle nog reg of is hulle nog nie in plek nie. En dan die hele storie rondom, ek gaan nie daaroor ingaan nie, dit het julle alreeds ook baie van gehoor, die hele storie van die globalisering van landbou en handel, en dan ook wat ons gesien het, as ons die parallel kan trek na die menslike faktor, met die COVID-19, die hele aanpassing van bakterieë en virusse, soos die omstandighede verander, om op 'n nuwe manier te voorskryf te kry, en dit kry ons ook in diere siektes redelik baie, dat daar 'n mutasie is en 'n aanpassing van patogene, en wat ons baie op ons tone moet bly, om ook daai bron van bedreiging vir biosekuriteit betyds die hoof te bied. En dan, ons weet dit almal en almal praat daaroor, en dit is die hele storie rondom verandering. Ek gaan nie nou daar in besonder nie, dit is 'n lesing heel op sy eie. En dan ook die verandering in die omgewing, wat 'n baie belangrike rol speel. En dan die verandering in die vatbaarheid van die spesies en diere vir siektes. Ek dink nie ons moet dit uit die oog uit verloor nie. Dis 'n ding wat van tyd tot tyd gedurig verander. En die volgende ene is armoede, en 'n goeie voorbeeld het ons nou gesien in Suid-Afrika met die vinnige verspreiding, soveel so dat dit nou 'n epidemie is in Suid-Afrika in terme van diere siektes, en dit is varkpes, wat van bo uit die noorde uit versprei tot onder die Kaap, en 'n groot rol daarin was die gebrek aan of die voedsel-onsekuriteit en die nodigheid om 'n baie goedkoop bron van vleis baie vinnig te versprei en nog steeds versprei, en in party plekke is dit onmoontlik nou om daai siekte heeltemal onder beheer te kry. En dan ekonomiese ontwikkeling en tegnologie. So ons moet net nigter oor al hierdie bedreiging vir biosekuriteit kyk, en dan raak dit vir ons ook maar logies om daarna te kyk. Now, if we look what we have available already in terms of measures to decrease or mitigate the risk in terms of biosecurity. And if you think carefully about it, if you look, for example, at the Animal Health Act and the regulations, each act says you must do this or you cannot do that. And why? It all points to what we had earlier in terms of the regulation, how to prevent the introduction and the spread of diseases. So the crux of the approach of the Animal Health Act and regulations is aimed at biosecurity. And if you look at it that way, I think in many ways you'll appreciate the act, but also realize the rationale behind many things and why we should be very careful that people obey that and comply with that regulations. And the same holds true for the Animal Meat Safety Act and the regulations. And then you all know that in terms of the new control measure that was introduced now, I think 2 years ago already for auctions, those requirements that need to be met for arranging auctions, but also conducting auctions. And unfortunately, it looks like in the recent outbreaks in the country, the one in Limpopo and also the one in Northwest, there was not compliance with those things that you introduced in good faith, and people don't obey by that. And then we all know about the HACCP plans at abattoirs. They all aim to mitigate the risk at very critical points in the ante and post-mortem process. That is also risk reduction in terms of biosecurity. And then the act on veebrandmerke, that one, dit weet ons, dit is ook een wat in beginsel daarop gemik is om te help onwettige beweging ongecontroleerde beweging om dit ook op 'n manier te beheer. En dan natuurlik die OAI-kode in sy geheel is ook gemik op biosekuriteit. So een ding wat ons van moet bewus wees, dit is dat die virusse en die bakterieë daar buite is nie altyd sigbaar nie. And we can't always see them, and we are not always aware of them, but they are our enemies. And what we have to do to talk biosecurity, we have to be aware of what we are fighting. We are fighting human behavior, controlling the introduction of risk, but we must also be aware what lies behind that risk. And that is pathogens that we don't see with the eye, but are the primary cause of the break in biosecurity. Nou, iets wat ons nou al hoe meer begin bewus raak, ook as ons weer parallelle trek na die menslike kant toe, is die zoonotiese potensiaal van siektes en die impak wat dit het op biosekuriteit. Dit is bekend dat 60% van al die menslike patogene wat ons nou van weet, is hier zoonose. Dit beteken, kan aangesteek word van diere na mense. Ek hoef nie 'n voorbeeld te noem, julle ken dit almal. Dis griep, voëlgriep, dis hondsdolheid, baie van hulle. En dan ook ander, ek sal nie hulle nou bespreek nie. Dan, wat ons ook van bewus moet wees in terme van biosekuriteit, is dat 80% van al hierdie patogene het meer as een gasheer. Dit wil sê, soos back and closure, is nie net beeste nie, dit is ook skape en bokke en ander gespleethoewige diere, wat almal 'n rol speel in die bedreiging van biosekuriteit. En dan vandag word dit algemeen erken dat 75% of meer selfs van die opkomende diere siektes het 'n zoonotiese potensiaal. Dit wil sê, kan van diere na mense versprei. En dan iets wat ons ook van bewus is, dat die bioterrorisme potensiaal van baie van hierdie patogene word al hoe meer, die mense is bang daarvoor, vir ook die bedreiging van biosekuriteit. En dan, wat hiermee saamgaan, is dat al die nuwe menslike siektes kom van 'n dierereservoir. En dan laastens, dit weet ons nou, maar ons besef nie altyd dit in terme van biosekuriteit. En dit as siektes kan vandag vinniger oor die wêreld sprei in 'n land as die gemiddelde inkubasieperiode van 'n siekte. As ons byvoorbeeld vat wat die OAI se standaard definisie 7 dae is, maar net die OAI definisie, die werklike inkubasieperiode kan so kort soos 3 dae wees. In 3 dae kan 'n virus versprei van China af na Suid-Afrika met 'n vliegtuig voor die dier en die siekte al weet. Dit wil sê korter as die inkubasieperiode. En selfs in ons eie land, dier kan die siekte optel, maar nog nie die siekte wys nie, en dan kan hy môreoggend in die Kaap wees en dalk die siekte daar sprei. So dit moet ons van diere en dierlike produkte, die spoed waarmee dit gebeur, is al hoe belangriker om te besef in terme van biosekuriteit. Hierdie is 'n spotprent wat onlangs in 'n Hollandse koerant verskyn het, en dit sê vir ons duidelik, waar staan ons op die oomblik, met voëlgriep, varkpes, malkoei siekte, COVID, en ook nou die hele storie rondom aappokke. Die verhouding tussen die menslike en die dierlike geneeskunde begin al hoe nouer na mekaar toe trek. So, wat ons reeds gesê het, is dat die materiaals wat nodig is om die toepassing van biosekuriteit vereis, dat ons reeds genoem het, die vinnige verspreiding wêreldwyd van die siektes vinniger as die inkubasieperiode, dan dink ek moet ons dit erken, daar is nie meer plek in die wêreld waarvandaan ons te ver of waarvan ons afgesonder is in terme van 'n biosekuriteitsrisiko vir siekteverspreiding. Dit is net 'n feit wat ons moet aanvaar. Soos wat dit gegeld het, wat die siekte baie vinnig versprei het van China af tot reg oor die wêreld. Dieselfde geld ook vir diere siektes. Ons kan self ons eie voorbeeld noem, die verspreiding van die werkingklouseer vanaf Limpopo provinsie na Noordwes. En kom ons wees bly dat dit net nie baie verder is dit gegaan nie. Ons sit op die oomblik met ongekende verspreiding in 5 provinsies wat nog nooit plaasgevind nie. So dit kan baie vinnig gebeur. As ons kyk na die huidige wêreldwye stand van werkingklouseer in terme van wat vry verklaar is deur die OIE, kan ons sien daar lê die groot risikogebiede. Die groen, daar is almal lande wat alreeds of vry met of vry sonder inenting het. En dan as ons kyk na in terme van Suider-Afrika, sal ons sien op die oomblik is dit net Namibië, Botswana en dan Lesotho en Swaziland en natuurlik Madagaskar daar in die eiland. So in die res van Afrika, kyk Indië, China, Rusland, al daai plekke is nog almal steeds besmet. So wat dink die wêreld in terme van handel as ons praat oor biosekuriteit? Die vereistes, die kernvereistes wat gestel word. Is kom dit daarop neer en dit is waaroor aan ons moet werk, of dit nou 'n voerkraal is of kommersiële boerdery of 'n intensief of ekstensiewe boerdery. Dit gaan oor die sanitêre waarborge wat kan word, wat die naaste kom aan dit wat die invoerder vereis. Dit wil sê as ons uitvoer, dan gaan 'n ander land sanitêre vereistes, biosekuriteitsvereistes stel wat sy bedryf of sy land se bedryf sal beskerm. En dit is wat ons moet kan aanbied as ons suksesvol wil die kern van die verhandelingsproses. En dit word dan saamgevat in protokolle wat ook al, maar dit is waaroor dit gaan. So as ons het gesê ons sal werkingklouseer as 'n voorbeeld gebruik. So if you look at that from the spread of foot and mouth disease since 1931, don't worry about the other colors. Look at the dark bars that represent South Africa. You see, in the beginning it was going up and down, but then there was control in terms of movement and so on. And then it came up, and then we had exposure or access to very good vaccines. And then the whole thing went down, and there was very strict control about areas of non-vaccinated. But since the beginning of 2010, 2011, it just went up and up, and the occurrence of the disease just went higher and higher. If we look at the figures, current is now, the last one is now even more. It is more than 100 now, the total number of outbreaks. I think the last count was 102 or 105. But you see, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 provinces that have active outbreak of foot and mouth disease. So why I show this is not to criticize, but to bring reality by security to what I've said earlier about the common factors for the break in biosecurity or the threat in terms of security, movement and uncontrolled movements and so on. A total lack of realization of importance for preventing a situation like we have here in front of us. So we all know this map. We have the outbreaks in Limpopo, we have the outbreaks in North, in Gauteng, and then the area there in KwaZulu-Natal. Now, what are the main risk factors in terms of biosecurity that we have to take note of? What happened with the foot and mouth disease? It was the move, uncontrolled and illegal of animals that was a main culprit in spread of the disease. The thing that is common, or what has been accepted in South Africa, is the issue of people moving from the rural areas to the urban areas. A good friend of mine with the WHO used the term the ruralization of the urban environment. What that means is that people that move from the rural areas to the urban areas bring their animals with them. So what we see now is around cities, we have people with their animals there, and animals are in many ways uncontrolled, and they use it as a source of. So not only have they brought the animals there, but they also brought the risk of animal diseases and the risk of spread of animal diseases. And this is a reality that we must be aware of, and we've seen it so clearly with the outbreak of African swine fever currently in South Africa. And one thing that we've seen, enough evidence, sad evidence, and that is the movement from auctions, which is a time bomb in terms of the impact of spread of disease, because you have one auction, but those animals move to 10, 15, even more destinations. And that means 10, 15 or more farms getting infected with a disease if this is not controlled. Then also there are occasions which create high risk for biosecurity. That is where people move from the cities back home over Easter weekends and seasonal festivities, where people, not only the people move, but the people also take food along with them back home. And many often this food is infected with a disease and spreading disease. And then what we had in many cases, not only in South Africa, but we've seen a lot of that in several countries in South America, in Brazil, in Uruguay, Paraguay, those places where you have family relationship across borders, which is also a high threat in terms of biosecurity. And then what we often tend to ignore, we talk about quarantining farms or quarantining animals that the animals can't move. That's good, it must happen. But one thing that played a big role in the 2000 outbreak in KwaZulu-Natal, in the Camperdown outbreak, was the movement of people from an infected farm to non-infected farm. People go and visit their friends at the evening or over weekends, and they take the infection with them. And now I think it also played a role in at least 2 or 3 cases that I were in discussions with people, is the movement of people from infected farms to non-infected farms. We must be very careful with that in terms of biosecurity. And then the need for food, the whole issue of food insecurity, the illegal slaughter of animals, and then the movement of those very often infected meat and products. And then I think we must acknowledge that. I feel very sad when I mention that, but it's true, and that is the lack of knowledge of the importance of very quick and fast outbreak response in terms of especially foot-and-mouth disease outbreak. Unfortunately, many people don't have the knowledge because they were never exposed or had the opportunity to be trained by other experienced people how to manage good outbreak response in terms of disease control. There's such a big gap between people knowing and people not knowing. The people knowing are people mostly on the verge or already have retired, that were actively involved in outbreak response and major disease epidemic control. And then, and this is not only true of the veterinary profession, but also in terms of producers and also officials working in infected areas. And then the last one here that is also important of biosecurity is the people are getting compliant. They blasé about the disease. Oh no, it will come right. Don't worry, we will manage. So if we look at what we used to know about foot-and-mouth disease, we had the cycle from buffalo that are permanent carriers of disease to impala, which act as sentinels and other game, and then from there to cattle. That was a normal cycle in the foot-and-mouth disease control areas in Mpumalanga and in Limpopo province. But now the picture has changed. the high risk factors now. Okay, it comes initially from buffalo to cattle, but then from there, infected cattle at feedlots, at auctions, move uncontrolled to many other places, and also the whole issue of not being aware or make people aware, farm workers and so on, in terms of biosecurity compliance, in terms of disease spread. That is also becoming to play a more and more bigger role in terms of biosecurity. So just to look briefly in terms of foot and mouth disease, as an example, where does it link up to biosecurity? It is a high-risk disease in naive populations, meaning if you have animals not previously been exposed or not vaccinated, they are very susceptible, because foot and mouth disease is a highly contagious disease. Then, like I mentioned before, it is a multi-species disease in terms of cloven-hoofed animals. Then also for foot and mouth disease, we have the 3 types in South Africa, but they are also a threat of type O, which we had in KwaZulu-Natal, and we luckily could totally eradicate it, but now it is again in Namibia, in the north of Namibia, and also in Zambia. And the whole South African population currently is susceptible, highly susceptible, because it's a naive population for type O and type A. If it comes into the country, it will be a disaster in terms of disease spread. Also, foot and mouth disease, and we know it, it has a very severe trade impact on local, national and internationally. Nou weet ons ook, die siekte is baie hoogs aansteeklik. En dit is duur siekte om te beheer. Dit is nie goedkoop, ons weet dit, maar ongelukkig moet ons daar die geld beskikbaar stel. Dan, as 'n land soos Suid-Afrika gewees het, siektevrye status bereik deur die OIE, dan is dit nie goedkoop om daai status te behou nie. En dit vergeet mense baie keer. Sê, dis maklik, kom asseblief, laat ons so gou as moontlik iets doen om weer ons siektestatus te herwin. Maar mense moet altyd dink in die voorsiening vir die uitgawes en die infrastruktuur om daai status baie jaloers te beskerm. En dit kos geld. Meer geld as wat dit kos om aanvanklik 'n siektevrye status te bereik. En dan ook moet dit belangrik wees dat ons weet of die siekte, die enstof beskerm bied teen die huidige virus wat die siekte veroorsaak, die back and claw virus. En dan die effek op voedselsekuriteit. And then, lastly, what I said, the whole danger of complacency and not notifying the introductions of disease. And what we seen in African swine fever is also very disturbing and very sad. We only had it in that dark spot there, high up in the northern Transvaal and Limpopo province, and then it started to move south eventually, and many of the reasons what I already mentioned, the need for food, uncontrolled movement, and now it is right through the country, right into the Western Cape. So, but we also have the non-disease biosecurity risks relevant to animal disease control. And if we look at Africa, at the world, the whole economic and socio-economic consequences, the issue of transhumans, especially in West Africa, where people move around at certain time. And we see that at a certain extent in South Africa as well, where we have seasonal workers moving to and fro at certain times of the year. The issue of political instability caused disease in many countries in Africa especially. And then the priority rating of veterinary services. Unfortunately, when a crisis that's not related to animal diseases hits the country, then the money for veterinary services and agriculture, for that matter, often is money that are taken away to resolve the other priorities. And in South Africa, it is important, biosecurity risk, the whole issue of the wildlife, human, animal pathogen interface, and also the increase in poverty. So for farmers, in short, that we must time is running out now, is that you should only buy from a reliable source. You must make sure that you get guarantees from the seller of the animals that could be verified, not just sales stock. And then, where possible, let animals be examined before you bring them onto your farm. And then, please, if you're going to keep them live and for quick slaughter, they must be isolated for a while to make sure there is no disease in that. Even if they were moved, say, no, there's nothing wrong. And it should be away from the other animals. And you should make sure that your isolation facilities are different from the normal farming activities, like separate set of clothes and so on. And like I mentioned, in KwaZulu-Natal in 2000 with the Camperdown outbreak, that was a very important issue. So in short, what must we do in South Africa? We have naive populations currently in the Western Cape, the Northern Cape, and hopefully also in the Eastern Cape. A naive population where the disease is not yet, and animals who are never vaccinated. So they are very, very susceptible for foot and mouth disease. And even a farmer should know what the disease looks like. There are many things now available on the internet and on Google to see what the disease looks like. To know if you see it on your farm, suspect, then you know what you're looking at, and you can immediately make work that to report it. And also other diseases that looks like foot and mouth disease, like ons kry dit baie keer, beserings van doring, acacia species wat die pek beseer, en ag julle ken nou almal ander voetbeserings in diere. And as I said in the beginning, you must have a biosecurity plan and a contingency plan for biosecurity available on the farm. And you must do a risk analysis of the outbreaks. And if you look on a national scale, and also we are talking about it, we had discussions on that, on the possibility of movement control between provinces from infected areas. Sorry, this thing jumped around. Then also to establish the capacity for immediate outbreak response. That is so critical for biosecurity. And the possible need for a national fund to be available to quickly act on any disease outbreak for foot and mouth disease. And also it's important to know who's in control, and you can't control disease from a distance. You need to be on the spot available and make use of other people also to do that. Okay, and obviously what the OIE code says is also very applicable to South Africa. Dit moet 'n baie effektiewe veeartsenydiens hê. Die siekte moet aanmeldbaar wees, soos in Suid-Afrika dit is, maar dan aanmeldbaar met 'n doel. En voortdurende waarneming, continuous surveillance, vinnige rapportering van 'n siekte en, nog belangriker as dit, is vinnige reaksie daarop. En die bewys van die afwesigheid van virussirkulasie, die skeiding van diere, en dan die bewaring of the maintenance of the animal health measures to prevent. En die OIE kode noem hulle dit, en dit weet ons moet ons ook in Suid-Afrika toepas. So in opsomming, die voorsitter, waar staan ons met biosekuriteit? In die middel het jy 'n effektiewe veeartsenydiens. You have in the middle an effective need for effective veterinary services that creates a biosecurity buffer. On the one side, between animal diseases, zoonosis, and things like agritourism, and on the other side of that buffer, you have animal health to concern human health, poverty, food insecurity, and then also obviously the trade and production implications. So if the fact that many of the African diseases has gone to other parts of the world, like foot and mouth disease and so on, and swine fever is moved from African swine fever moved now to many parts of the world. People are getting more sensitive about diseases in Africa. So the trade, the sanitary gears requirements required from South Africa will get more difficult as the time goes on. So we must be vigilant to prevent that situation develop where people are going to ask, hey, but you live in a country where all these diseases occur, what biosecurity guarantees can you give us? So in closing, I think we must be aware and we must be prepared, and we must ask ourselves on a producer base, are we ready and are we prepared? And I think we all don't wish that such a situation like on this slide will ever occur again in South Africa at that scale. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Wow. Dr. Giron, baie dankie. Dis 'n mondvol en ek dink ons kan maar net geweldig dankbaar wees dat ons 'n persoon soos jy kon kry wat van die ou HI af terug is by die huis. Dankie vir jou insette by die biosekuriteitstaakspan. En ek het maar net diep onder die indruk gekom van hoe tegnies van hierdie goed is. En ons is regtig afhanklik van mense soos julle wat al die kennis het, maar ook die praktiese goed verstaan. Jy het die ander dag 'n opmerking gemaak. Ons moet nooit dink dat ons nie 'n verskil kan maak nie. Jy het byvoorbeeld gesê dat kom jy in ander lande, dan as jy in die bufferzone ingaan, is daar baie groot borde wat dit aandui. So hier's 'n klomp huiswerk wat jy vir ons gee. Ons luister graag. En baie geluk ook dat op hierdie stadium is dit definitief so dat die insette wat jy lewer direk omtrent tussen jou en die minister is vir sekere intervensies. Baie dankie. Daar's ongelukkig nie tyd vir vrae nie. Melanie en Nico, dankie vir jou vraag. Nico se vraag gaan spesifiek oor inenting, maar ons gaan vir Dr. Gideon vra om daai een vir ons te antwoord. Ons sal ook moet kyk, dankie Dr. Gideon, die provinsies wat nog skoon is, en selfs die provinsie waar die probleme is, dat ons van die dieregesondheidsforum spesifiek in die provinsies sal kyk na audits. Ons het mos nou gesien, ons is bietjie ontkant gevang, en laat ons wat die ander provinsies aanbetref, nou die huiswerk doen, dat 'n mens sal weet waar jy is. Dr. Gideon, baie dankie. Ons het dan 'n video van Santam en dan gaan die program vorentoe.
Farming plays a vital role in the economy and sustainability of our country. From herding and harvesting, it has grown and evolved into an innovative, fast-paced industry. Today's farmers are skilled business people who use the Internet of Things to run these commercial enterprises and share their products with the world. Because farmers do so much more than farm, they need more than just insurance. As the leading agricultural insurer in South Africa, Santam has the specialist solutions, in-depth expertise and infrastructure to meet each farmer's unique needs and manage their risk on and off the farm, while keeping their business running the good and proper way. Choose the insurer who understands the future of farming. Speak to your intermediary or visit santam.co.za.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker on the industry is Wandile Shilobu. Wandile, I know you now as the go-to person when it comes to agricultural economy, and I know for a fact that the minister also makes use of you on a regular basis. Thank you very much. We would like to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, colleagues, and good afternoon to everyone that is online. I know I'm standing between you and dinner or afternoon snacks, and unfortunately we still have the next 40 minutes to go. I was talking to the technical guys there. They said, no, I can push the envelope a little bit, so you can stretch your legs and get ready for that long session. Hopefully, and thank you also to the other colleagues, because the remarks I will make, they really join in to what the previous speakers have already spoken about. You heard the remarks from Chairman Faber when he was speaking about how the industry standing is looking like. Gerard Francois also on his points. So I will really be joining in there. And what I was asked by Corinne when we talked about the session, she said I could speak about anything that is related to the economy and trying to bring all of the story together. And I almost resisted, as you were seeing me sitting with the mask on, because I also have a bit of a fluish, but I had heard about the CEO's meat pies, which I thought they would also be served in here. But I'm hoping that we will find them somewhere outside. But the 6 points really that I will speak about, because Gerard, you've pulled in all of the industry stuff about how the industry is looking like. So I think I should just maybe tie it on by making the points on the global economy, because at the end of the day, as we are sitting here, we are operating as the industry in the agricultural economy, and the agricultural sector is operating in the economy, and South Africa is part of the world. We might have a relatively small share of the exports for now, but I think everything else that happens in the world does matter a lot to us as the industry. And in my view, or at AgBusiness view, we can really summarize the world economy by those 8 points that you see on the screen. The first one is the issue of the infections. We are sitting nicely in this room. There's no masks a lot. We are well in South Africa, but in other places, there's still all of this COVID thing. And of course, monkeypox is spreading all over. California and the others are declaring it as a bit of a crisis. So I think it's important. And the reason I bring it here is because of the impact on the supply chain, which is number 3 on those blocks that are there. And that matters a lot for the world economy, on how business are doing, what's the cost of doing everything that we see in the world. And I think the issue of invasion, it matters. And for the industry that we are in, when we think about the feed costs and the grain industry and everything that happens in the Ukraine, I still think it's an important stuff when we think about the world economy. It does seem that there are conversations that are happening with all of these grain exports starting to come out, but I think it will last for longer, and that's an important theme we should really be thinking about. But I think the most important one, and which will hit the farmers a lot, is number 4 in there, and nicely linked perhaps with number 5 in those points that are in the screen, because the rising inflation as a result of all of the disruption that I'm talking about, I think at the core it ends to that increase in the interest rates. And I think the cost of capital is the one thing that we can all worry about in South Africa. We are sitting, I think, in an agricultural sector that has a farm debt of just under 200 billion rands. And I think if the interest rates are rising aggressively as we see in the world, and I think that's the most important thing that we should worry about. It might seem minimal, but if you were to think about where the interest rates were in 2020 when COVID started, and then we saw the South African Reserve Bank dropping interest rates by roughly 300 basis points. That saved our sector combined around about 6.5 billion rands in debt servicing cost. And I think that's substantial if the interest rates continue to rise aggressively at this point, as we see at this moment. And I think the points that Francois spoke about at the start on climate change, he spoke about the effect and the dangers about how that is ending up. But I think the regulations that are being put in place by some of the countries in Europe and the others about how to produce in a crop farming, but of course extending to the livestock, and the general consumer view of the industry that we are in is something that we cannot totally ignore, especially in the world market, about how should we be thinking along that perception. It might be true or not as true, just like you saw in the discussion about the genetically modified crops, where they are really help in boosting productivity and protecting the yields and feeding the people. But the perception was that they are bad things that should be taken out and all of those things. So those are the realities about how people should be thinking about these things that I think we should consider in those long-term views that we think about these things. And of course, you mentioned, Gerard, that in the new organization, you'll be looking at the export story. And I think with the deglobalization and the rising protection, those are some of the things that Dewald and the colleagues, as they implement, they will have to be facing some of those realities onto this thing. Let me put this story just very quickly of the inflation stuff that I was talking about and the interest rates. I think the core thing, if you can just look for a moment on that graph, the line that you see dotted in there, that's where the inflation rates in some of those countries were 10-year average. That's the line that we plugged in there. And there's a small dots within those bars. That's the inflation rate last year. At the moment, you have inflation rate in those blue bars that you see there. And the most effective tool that the central banks will be using to control that is, of course, that interest rate story that I was talking about. And I think this is the major threat that we are all really talking about, and many people are worried about on this story. And I think ultimately, all of this links to the growth stuff. You will hear more of the nuance on this when Ferdi and Gerald and the guys at BFAP present the baseline in the coming weeks. But the bottom story is that the world economy is slowing. The demand for meat is one of those things that is also slowing, which is why, Gerard, when you were saying that the local market is so important, and I think it ties in with that story, because in the world, people's money is shrinking, and it will be diverted to other things. If we think of inflation, we think of slowing growth, not only this year, but for the next 3 years or so, there will not be sufficient growth and demand for some of the high value products in the world market. And I think those are big themes that are out there, but in one way or another, they do have an impact about how as the industry will be performing. And I think the South African story is also really important, because in South Africa, it seems to us, and really many people at the Reserve Bank, at IMF and the others, this year could be better. We could grow over 2%. But for the next 2 or 3 years, the South African economy is likely to grow again at like under 2%. And I think for the environment that is like that, you're likely then going to see a rise in unemployment or remaining at these levels that are over 35%. And there are socio-economical consequences on that, either through strikes or political unrest or whatever that we will see. And as the industry, even if we can do well, in reality is that there is no tree that can thrive in the desert. If outside there, the economy is not well, our sector can only really do well for so long. And I think the points that Gerald, you were raising about the next, the roughly 2 million hectares of land or so that is underutilized, which could be used, is very important when we think about low growth. What can agriculture do? And I think the work of BFAP in those 5 pillars, he outlined here one pillar, but there's those 5 pillars for other commodities that can be really useful when we think about the unemployment and the role at which agriculture can pretty much play in saving South Africa onto that. And I think the politicians do get it at that point. You mentioned that we talk to ministers and the others, Mr. CEO, and you are 100% correct on that. They do get the point of the role of agriculture. These are numbers coming out of BFAP and the BER. They kind of pointing exactly why agriculture is important. You're looking at 2010 and to today, and you say, how have we performed? These might not be reflecting in your pockets per se, because the input costs have also been rising at these levels. But the bottom point is that there is growth and activity in this sector, in all of these major subsectors of it. And it speaks to the BFAP presentation, looking back over a decade onto that. But I think the near-term view that you will get from the media about agriculture will likely be negative. At AgBiz, we're looking at 3 to 5% contraction this year. Again, fresh numbers are coming out of the baseline in a week or two. If you watch Ferdi and the colleagues when they present that will give us a much more accurate picture on this. But I think they will point to a contraction in as far as the agricultural economy activity is concerned this year. But I think that is not something that we should really be worried a lot about, because there are baseline effects, and it's clear to outline on what are the problems that will be causing that contraction. The key thing that we would have been worried is if we didn't know clinically about what is really causing some of these challenges. And I think the key thing really to see this is if you can pay attention for a moment
on the slide that is showing up on the screen, particularly the one under 2020, because what we try to do there is to show the most important subsectors when one thinks about the agricultural economy in South Africa, primary agriculture. This is from a paper I wrote with Professor Johan Kirsten last year. What it does is just mapping you up. Your industry, of course, second largest when we think about the importance, but I think some of the most important industries like maize, citrus, deciduous fruits, they faced a number of challenges over the past few months, which is what adds on top of the baseline story that I was talking about to that contraction that we expect in agriculture this year. Let me speak a little bit as I head towards the closing of these remarks again about next season, because I think it's important. Francois, in his opening remarks, made an important thing about the changing climate. And from your side, on the RPO side, Gerard, I think the issues of animal diseases are likely going to be more prevalent. Again, I think it links back to Dr. Gideon's presentation, because the question I was asking him about how intense are the La Ninas, as well as the occurrence of the El Ninos as the opposite one, is a key thing that when I speak with many people, they are really worried about. The near-term outlook, it does indeed, from the South African, Australians, and the US, talk to another La Nina next year, the 2022-23 season. But I think what we should be worried a lot about is the intensity of that La Nina. We might actually see it being more intense than what we have seen this year, which was already a heavy rains, if you think about from October going on into the end of January, October last year, the end of January this year. And I think that's the most likelihood that we could see again this year. So the various diseases then in the livestock industry, piggery, that you experience in these times, I do think those are the things we should be worried a bit about. The other thing we might have to think about is the impact of that on your feeding industry, the guys in the grains. They might plant the usual area of 4.3 million hectares, but the tonnage, the quality of that, and all of those things are some of the factors we should really be thinking about deeply when we think about next year and the impact thereafter broadly on the livestock sector. And I emphasize this because if you look over the past few months, what is happening in the US, in Italy, Spain, China, there are all of these weather extremes. I mean, just about a few months ago in Kansas, there was about over 2,000 cattle that died over the heat stress. And we continue to see all of these things in parts of rural Spain. We hear about some of them in China. And I think then the opposite of that on the extreme is what we should really be worried about. And long term, when we are in the El Nino parts in South Africa, as well as our neighboring countries. So let me just make a closing remarks on the issues of policy, because I think that's where we spend a bit of time from an AgBiz side, and also my work partially in government stuff is largely on these things around about policy. And I think it's important when we think about long-term sustainability of this sector. And on the policy side, I mean, Gerard's presentation spoke directly onto these things, and the crux of the point that I want to pull up on his presentation was that the problems of South Africa's agriculture are clear, and from a government side, I think they do understand them this time around, and everybody is clear about those. And from an AgBiz side, we rank them as those 5 points that you see there on that slide, which is broadly the inefficiencies in the state administration. And this is all that talks to Act 36, biosecurity, and all of those particular points. Infrastructure, with regards to our roads, the water infrastructure, the roads, and all of those things. And I think that is well understood. The issues of security is important. Even where I come from in the Transkei, we struggle with security, our stock theft and all of those things. And of course, even in the commercial farms, there's a lot of that, and farmer tax. And I think the most emerging and important one now is also the direct vandalization in South Africa's infrastructure. there seems to be organized crime on Transnet infrastructure, ESCOM infrastructure, and all of that we do see, and it's affecting all of the industries. And I think that's something that is very important. At least now, even in the guys in Union Building are pretty much clear about the threats of that to the stability of the country. And I think it's a most serious thing, in addition, of course, to the agriculture-focused point. The other thing that I think is also understood, and it's turning positively, and I will speak on this in a moment as I close, is the issue of uncertainty that we've all in agriculture been talking about, land uncertainty and all of these things. And we've been doing a work in here for a while ago with the late, great Professor Mohammed Karan, Dr. Vuyo Mahlati, and many people that we've worked on this point for many years around the expropriations and all of those things. But I think the other important point, Gerald, you closed with this while you were also emphasizing the domestic market stuff, and even the Herald at BFEP spoke eloquently on this, is the issue of the research and the exports. You might have your own markets that you have identified for DeWalt, but we think broadly for agriculture at AgBiz, the most important markets that needs to be added is Japan, is India, China, Saudi Arabia, and Bangladesh. And this is not specific to the red meat, but on agriculture, and saying what markets should you be adding to the pack of countries that we have. And I think the guys in government are also beginning to prioritize those points. The key thing then that is left now that everyone agrees, as all of us as South Africans on those points, is about how do you tackle them. And I think that working together, Yolanda, on your side with JFK, you speak a lot about these partnerships. And I think that's where the crux of the things needs to come on. And the master plan underlines those points of saying, what skills do we have? Where do we have a gap? How do we partner in each of those points? And I think that's where the discussion, and even the minister herself, I can speak for her on that point to say she agrees and she's open to partnering in these points. And that's the posture that we take also at AgBiz about all of those points that I've highlighted there. And I think the issue of exports beyond the livestock industry is particularly important when we think about growth of the sector. The figures I have, and I think my friends at BFEP have the same figures, is that we are now exporting roughly 51% of what we produce in value terms in South Africa. Last year, that was a good number, valued at about $12.4 billion of agricultural products. It means that if you look in our exports as a country, that's somewhere around about 8% of South Africa's overall exports coming out of agriculture. That's substantial, because even then in employment, that translates positively. Primary sector, we are employing about 860,000 people as this sector. You add agro-processing jobs onto that, they are around about 460,000 people that are also there. So combined, agriculture and agro-processing, you have roughly 1.3 million people or so that are dependent on this sector. So we are a valuable one when you think about the economy. Now that the numbers are looking like that, and the chart on your left-hand side, if you could look to it for a moment, it has that dark bluish bar that is there. That's where our exports are. If then we are about to follow Gerald's point on that BFEP had outlined about where those 5 pillars are, we will need to have some markets to push those products to. Otherwise, profitability will become an issue and a bit of saturation in the domestic market, which is why I think it's important. And I think it's important beyond Africa. I know when you listen to DTIC and the other guys, there's all of this story about Africa is important, African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But the work we have done with Tinashe Kapuya, we turned out to be quite bleak about the whole Africa story, at least over the next decade. We think those markets I had outlined earlier on are more important than in the continent. In the continent remains an important market. 40% of our exports goes to Africa. But if you look where are they all concentrated, roughly 89% of them are within the SADC region. Outside, it's a few bits to Nigeria, a few bits to some countries. And then if you think about beyond that, there are logistical costs that are quite rife on getting those products there. And I think over the next decade or so, as I say, the work with Tinashe that we had done for academic purpose was not as promising on that point. But I think you colleagues, as I close, you've done amazingly. I mean, this is the beef exports. That number is likely going to be down, that green line this year. But I think the whole point is when we look at the RPO 2030 strategy that is on the agenda for today, the point is, yes, the number might come down for 2022, 23, but leading up to 2020, 30, that's that number that we need to increase. Because the bottom point is, while we say the domestic consumer is important, South Africans are under pressure. There is no income. They just can't afford some of the products that we're going to be producing. And I think then the issue of the exports become increasingly important in that, because you have households that completely just don't have any income. I see I am being told to conclude. I have 2 slides. Let me wrap up this point. These points are important. The point I want to close on is around the events of the past weekend at the ANC and the whole story around expropriation, and as to whether the people of the ANC understands if agriculture is important or not. I think they do. Officially in their reports, even dating from a paper they released, it's in their website, the new website, which is the ANC and something a number. They had an old website, but they forgot to pay for it and it was shut down. The new one has these documents. And the first point is what they say about agriculture, which is that agriculture remains an important sector of the South African economy. It seems like a simple statement, but it is important when it comes from someone that is a governing party of the country, because it is a policy suggestion and a posture about how our sector is viewed. And the second point they say is that when they think about land reform, they are thinking about the Land Reform Agency, Land Reform and Agriculture Development Agency, which could take agriculture forward. And they're putting an emphasis on an expropriation bill rather than on expropriation as a Section 25 debate that was ravaging across the country. And that agency, more work has already been done behind the scene, but the minister will speak for herself there about what the agency entails. But basically, it will be involving private sector participation as well as the public participation, and it will focus mainly, we think, around the land redistribution part. That land that Gerald talks about, the millions of hectares, it's some of those land supplies which will be under the agency, and the agency will begin to think about how do you select the right beneficiaries to benefit onto that. And they will do that not out of their own thinking, but there is a policy, beneficiary selection criteria policy, that will guide their decisions in thinking about that point. If we succeed on doing that, I think that begins to take away political pressure from other things. And my plea in the red meat industry, as we sit here, will be to that we have to try to support these PPP approaches, particularly related to risky things like land reform. Because if we support it and it goes successfully, then it takes away all of the other pressures that have kept us in a really bad shape over the past couple of years. Because then it will mean that there's progress, there's new farmers that are coming in, the structure of our sector begins to change, pie get bigger, and changes nicely. And I think that's important, which is why I then added the issues around the master plan as the important levers that will guide us to go forward. So let me close by saying, if you remember anything in what I have said, it's perhaps maybe those 4 points that are in the screen. That the South African economy for the next 2 years or so, 2 to 3 years, we're likely going to be in bad shape. Supply chains disruptions will continue to be there, which means the cost of inputs that needs to be shipped will remain tough. Inflation will remain elevated. The cost of money, adding to the input costs that are already expensive, is what will make things tougher in the next term. The sector, we have sufficient food, we have done well. I think we are in fairly good shape, but I think the issue of La Nina and the intensity of it is something that we have to watch as we approach the next season. And lastly, it seems that the policy is changing to be positive, and I think we can lean on the master plan and the other instruments to combine our efforts in those partnership. Mr. Chairman and Gerard from RPO side, from AGBIS, we are thankful for the opportunity to speak. The slides will be made available if I ran quite fast on some. Thank you so much.
Wandile, thank you very, very much. Yeah, have a seat, please. You spoke a lot about policy, and you're a policy trendsetter. We are very much at ease that you have direct and official inputs to the Minister, but also be assured that when you give us policy directions, we as an organizations listen to that. So it's not a one-sided affair. I can assure you that PPPs will play a big part in Deewald's future and in the red meat industry. So we are there. Thank you very much for that. Again, a few questions, if you don't mind. We don't have enough time. We should have had more time, but thank you very much. And with that, we go over to the next video. That is from Design Biologics. Karen, thank you for being here. Thank you for sponsoring. OBP will always play a big part in vaccine production, but we, from the National Animal Health Forum, and I think from the RPO side, think that free market and free market enterprise will play a major role in the next few years within our industries. And thank you for taking us through your new setup a few months ago. It's state of the art. We are proud of having facilities like that in South Africa. Thank you.
Design Biologics started as a dream between three friends, colleagues, and dedicated animal health professionals 28 years ago. Peter Smits, Karen Nell, and George Gainsler officially started Design Biologics in 1994. In one tiny lab located at the CSIR in Pretoria. The lab was equipped with the oldest, most affordable equipment that could get the job done. In the very beginning, Design Biologics only manufactured one product, an intradermally administered pasteurellosis vaccine called Pastvac. This vaccine was manufactured for Dr. Jan Marnovic, the vet father of feedlots, to reduce incidence of shipping fever in calves. Pastvac vials were labeled by hand and vaccines delivered in person to the door of the vet's home and later to Phoenix in Midrand. Over the past 27 years, Design Biologics expanded, but we remained on the CSIR campus, serving mostly the feedlot industry. As demand increased, so did our manufacturing and product range. We have expanded our range of vaccines to accommodate a broader base of commercial animals and sensitive wildlife species. These included cattle, sheep, goats, aquaculture, wildlife species including rhino, sable, lion, cheetah, and wild dog, and exotic species such as seahorses, coatimundas, lemurs, and Phoenix foxes. With this expansion, our annual vaccine output also increased from 0.7 million doses to 20 million doses, and later to 40 million doses. Not only did the output increase, but our personnel also grew, along with our infrastructure and equipment needs. This ultimately led to the decision to acquire a new home for Design Biologics. The new Design Biologics home is currently under construction in Pretoria East. This impressive facility will enable us to increase our current vaccine output tenfold to 400 million annual vaccine dosages. 7,000 square meters of the new facility will be dedicated to the manufacturing of our different vaccines, and 2,600 square meters of the 7,000 square meters will be used for aseptic rooms where vaccines can be manufactured without any cross-contamination. This new facility will also be outfitted with solar panels that will be able to produce 300 kilowatts of power, as well as generators and an inline UPS that will enable us to seamlessly continue with manufacturing despite load shedding or other power interruptions. The new facility will also allow Design Biologics to align with the quality standard of good manufacturing practice. The first phase of personnel will move into the new facility in August 2022, and we aim to finalize the move by the end of 2023.
Thank you very much. And thank you to partners. I must say, I am really privileged to have one of our biggest partners, and I call them partners. It's not sponsors only, because they are our friends, they are part of our business, and we're doing daily business with them. And here I'd like to thank you to Formal and Mr. Kenny Crampton, as you heard already. It's a long partnership, Kenny, that we are coming with, and we must really appreciate this. And as you have indicated today, you come and give us again some of your funds that collected over the year. So, yeah, Kenny, we can really thank you for this big partnership. And over years, and I hope for the next years that's coming, that we can still have this partnership. And then I must also say, you know, you've got a lot of partners in this whole business, and we can't do our work without this partners.
Thanks very much, James. Thanks very much for that. Just maybe in the beginning to say thank you very much for the invitation. It's been an absolutely great afternoon. Been very, very interesting from all sides. I think especially on the side that we're now getting a plan and moving forward, and we see the potential in our industry. As Fumal and as an animal feeds, we need our farmers. That's where we make our livelihood. Without our livestock farmers, we wouldn't have a business. So it's always an absolute privilege. This relationship that we've had for so many years, it's a privilege for me to come every year and see and look and see what it is that we can add to the package. Maybe just a bit about the sponsorship. It's more, as you say, a partnership and not a sponsorship. It's not an amount that we put aside. It's what we've done is we've tied it to our fattening concentrates, our SP100 for cattle and our SS200 for sheep. We tie the amount that we sell of that product over the year, we give a percentage to the RPO. So in other words, as many people that are part of the RPO and make use of our product, they can put something back into the RPO as well. And it's always nice to see when we get to the end of June to see exactly what the amount is. And I'd like to say that the amount this year is 134,681. And I'd like to just hand over the check to you, James. And thanks very, very much for everything. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Kenny. We really appreciate this. Yeah, and we are honored to be associated with Fumal. Thanks very much, Kenny.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, Kenny. Thank you, everyone. With that said and done, as we need to get to conclusions and then just say thank you to some of our people. I think in conclusion today for me really is inspiring to say that I realize today that we are more together than alone. And we need one another. We cannot carry on if we try to go on our own. You have a choice. Like in Afrikaans, they say, jy kan dwarstrek of jy kan saamwerk. It's not my choice, it's yours. But I think what we've learned today is that we will work together. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Prof. Francois Engelbrecht from WITS. And he made me think of a quote that I learned many years ago from Dr. Dani Bosman, who said, in South Africa, when you farm with cattle, worry about heat, don't worry about cold. When we look at Dr. Gideon Broekler, I think there's something that we need to realize, and that is we need to become self-regulating in this country. If we don't regulate our own business, no one else is going to do it for us. And that's very important. Gerard van der Burg, I think, Gerard, you made a lot of very good points. And
one of the things is I would pledge is that we stop using the word statutory levies. I think we should start talking about value chain levies. It's a statutory measure, but it's for the value chain. And I start to plead for that one. And I made a calculation on what you said. If we need to increase our production by 250,000 calves per year, it means close to 700 calves per day that we need to increase our production with, which is quite a challenge, and we need to think about that. When I think about Deerwold is for me like the hooker in the Springbok team, like our Blokkie Joubert, you know, that guy that they're singing about in the old song. And we need to support this guy, and we need to work with him. Lastly, Wandile, thank you for your visionary. Thanks for your economic visionary. Thanks for what you're doing for the whole industry. And we appreciate what you're doing and the words that you put in for us and how you work together with us. And then for the sponsors, Kenny, thank you very much once again. Then Mike from BKB for you and your team, Emo Pretoria, who's on virtual from Santam. And then we have Karen from Design Biologics. Thank you very much for your sponsorship. Members of the media, Landbouweekblad, Farmers Weekly, Marula Media, Agri TV, we have Plaas Media, and then we have the Rooivleis, the Red Meat magazine. Then all government officials that's here, thank you very much for your attendance. We appreciate it. And then especially our other role players, our other supporters from the rest of the value chain that took the day to come and attend and enjoy this day with us. Dan al die RPO se personeel en elke mens wat dan ook virtueel ingeskakel het, dankie vir julle tyd. Dan ook die samewerking van al ons provinsies, dankie vir julle wat ons altyd so ondersteun en ons bydra. En dan, as ek by die einde kom, dink ek, het ek 'n verpligting en is dit vir my 'n verpligting om vir James dankie te sê vir sy visionêre uitgangspunt is om vir ons te sê gaan reële konferensie. Vir hom en hom teens, Dr. Teens Laas, ons drie werk verskriklik lekker saam as 'n dagbestuur en hierdie is 'n uitvloeisel daarvan Gerard vir jou en dan ook vir Corine, maar ek wil vir Corine hê, weet nie waar sy is nou nie, ek het haar nou die hele tyd gesien daar so, sy kom hier so. Asseblief Corine, ek wil baie graag hê jy moet vorentoe kom, want ek wil graag vir jou iets sê, of jy kan net daar bly staan. I think this is a girl that you can give any challenge to. When she came to me and she said, we spoke about this conference, I said to her, Green, you can do it on one condition. This will not cost the RPO 1 cent. And you know what? She made it. Thank you. And then thank you for everyone, and thanks for listening to us. There will be a last video, and with that we conclude the day. Thank you very much.
A red meat farmer is meant to farm, but often factors outside the farm can have an influence on a farm's productivity and a farmer's livelihood and profit. That is where the Red Meat Producers Organization, RPO, comes in. We are the official mouthpiece for the red meat industry, protecting and promoting the interest of commercial red meat producers throughout the entire value chain. We act on behalf of farmers when it comes to biosecurity, working with government to keep diseases out of your herd, animal health, working with vets and the National Animal Health Forum to ensure coordination and to source necessary vaccines. Trade, negotiating import and export tariffs, opportunities and agreements to ensure profits when your products leave the main gate. Stock theft and predation management, helping you keep out predators of all kinds. Government, lobbying on behalf of farmers when it comes to new laws and policies. Technology and production, coordinating efforts for national traceability, optimization, and sustainability. Consumer marketing, promoting a positive image of red meat products and nutrition. Market information and research, helping to ensure farmers can produce profitably to expand their enterprise. All so that our farmers can focus on what they should focus on: their farm, their herd, and a prosperous future.